Hello and good evening. Tonight's gentle journey takes us to rise of the Saxons, from North Sea marshlands to 1066. The untold epic. Lower the volume, rest your eyes, and let the past be your lullaby. If this brings you peace, consider liking and subscribing only if it truly helps, and share in the comments where you're joining us from and the hour there. Now, lights down, a soft fan if you have one, and let's begin our walk through history. The Saxon story begins where the wind rarely rests. On the North German plain, the horizon is a measured line, and the earth is a half land, half water marsh stitched by channels, rivers braided with sand, and long shelves of heath. Westphalia's uplands shepherd a stream's downslope, Holstein's boggy lowlands open to inlets and tidal flats. Farther north, the heathlands that would later bear the name Lower Saxony undulate toward the sea. Beyond them rises Jutland, tying shore to shore across the shallow seas. Rivers made this world intelligible. The Elbe, the Weser, the Ems, and the tributaries that fed them were not obstacles, but arteries. In summer, boats slid over bars with hides, amber, and grain stacked between ribs. In winter, channels slowed and hardened at the edges, turning routes into moving boundaries of black water. Wetlands connected places, and they kept them apart. Villages clustered on natural rises or human-made mounds, each a bead on a watery string, near enough to talk, far enough to differ. Coast and interior cultivated different talents. Along the salt marsh and the wadden shore, the day obeyed the tide. Mussel beds and fish runs had their own clocks, and the missed hour meant an empty table. Boats were not luxury here, but logic, the technology that turned creeks into roads and the storm margins into opportunities. Inland, the forest offered other riches, oak and beech for long beams, boar and deer for meat and hide, resin and honey for barter, and defensible ridges for a watch. Archaeology lets us overhear the first centuries. Early settlement layers in Holstein and Lower Saxony show planning rather than scattered ditches as straight as strings. Posts sunk deep, hearths centered under high smoke holes. At places like Feddersen-Vierde, people raised living ground on earthen terps to put winter floods under their feet. Long houses lay like spines in the wind, their thatch held by wooden riders, with side rooms for stores and craft. We will meet these homes closely in time. For now, remember that adaptation began early. Step inside for a moment. By candlelight, a woman coaxes embers into dawn, while a child pads across hard earth to peer at water drawn tight by the tide. A shallow boat, once a great trunk, now a patched plank vessel, rests cocked in the mud. A man checks a row of stakes where last night's fish dry to hardness. Someone lays out a haft and a blade, waiting to be married by the smith's heat. From the doorway you smell salt and peat, wool and smoke, the sour sweet tang of ale. This landscape rewards timing. Cut hay too late and the meadow floods. Miss the eel run and the larder thins. Families learn to live by a tide book written in moon and wind. Communities build in wood because wood is what they have, and because wood forgives mistakes. They prop their lives on little hills, dikes and terps, rising a few human heights above the flat, so that the spring meltwater can lick the edges without taking the hearth. Cattle are tethered on higher ground, boats wait below like second doorways to the world. From such practices, identity thickens. In these beginnings, there is no crown to bind the Saxons, only knots of households whose elders know the channels by memory and can name the fords in the dark. A man calls himself by his clearing or his bend in the stream, and place names grow like lichen on the language, marking where people met the land clearings, ridges, hollows, and forts. Speech belongs to the West Germanic family. Even now you can hear in it sounds that will later shape Old English. The northern horizon breathes possibilities. Experience accumulates quickly where water rules tide that lift a boat into yesterday's dry channel, a safe cove behind a sandbank, a trader with a bronze scale and a glass cup that looks like captured sky. The first boats are practical, built for current and estuary, but hands teach hands, and distances lengthen. Not yet the long, sleek hunters of later fame, those will come, but craft that can cross an estuary, then a bight, and, on a brave day, the short sea. Roman eyes noticed sometimes admiring, often wary. Geographers flattened northern names into careful Latin, and border officer counted boats as if numbers could stop a tide. To them, the people beyond the line were at once merchants and marauders, their sails as likely to bring salt and hides as trouble. Forts stiffened along the coast of Gaul and Britain. Patrols watched the horizon. Yet in these earlier centuries, the Saxons were one voice among many in the crowded chorus north of Rome. Belief rooted itself in odd corners of the landscape. Sacredness gathered where land behaved strangely at a spring that never froze, in a grove where the wind moved without a sound, over the mirror black of a bog. Offerings found their way to those thresholds in the world, twisted metal, animal bones, maybe a weapon once cherished and now surrendered. If, in time, assemblies will meet in such groves to judge and to govern, it will make sense. The place already holds a hush the people recognize. Because the land teaches patience, it also teaches when to risk. When the starlings braid themselves into evening and the moon drags a high tide through the channels, a small crew shoulders a boat and pushes off, hugging the reed shadow until the river collects beneath them like mussel. They ride the fallen water to the estuary, sit outside the surf lines for a listening moment, then take the gap. If the sky stays honest, they follow the low coast to another mouth, trade wood tar for salt fish, and learn the horizon here is not a wall but a membrane. Across Jutland, kinwords and craftwords match. To the west, island capes throw long shadows over water that invites courage. To the south, provinces under Roman law send back coins and glass that turn up in northern graves as treasures and as proofs of contact. The North Sea does not divide so much as organize a space, and the Saxons, like their neighbors, learn its grammar until the sea speaks to them in promises and warnings they can read. So our narrative opens quietly, smoke pushing through a roof vent and flattening under low cloud, fish hung from a lintel to harden, a child tasting brackish water and learning why dough behaves differently on a salt wind day, an old woman naming the week by moon and breeze. Later, we will stand beneath sacred boughs at an assembly, hear oaths sworn by firelight, and watch boats broaden into ships bold enough to cross an empire's gaze. But none of that breathes without this first chapter, the place that made the people. Before there were kings to sign with seals, there were hands raised in a circle beneath trees. The Saxon world learned early to braid independence with belonging. Villages clung to their mounded ground or the edges of a wood, each with its own customs. Yet when trouble or opportunity called, they found ways to stand together. No high capital held them. A confederation lived instead in oaths, in kinship lines, in the habit of gathering to speak and decide. The land itself eased this balance. Rivers divided and connected in the same breath. A chieftain could be strong on his stretch of riverbank, but to move men and grain and news, he needed his neighbors. So a polity grew that was more net than wall. At the heart of this order stood the circle called the Thing. You can almost hear it, the murmur of voices traveling among trunks, the thud of spear butts marking ascent, the pause when a speaker's eyes search for another's courage. Free men came to air disputes, to judge cattle trespass or blood spilled, to listen when someone proposed war or warned against it. They met at places already marked sacred by springs or groves, because old sanctity steadies new decisions. Judgment was not the bark of a ruler, but a woven sound, and even the proudest war leader measured his strength against the consent of those who carried his spears. Those spear carriers formed the living engine of Saxon ambition, the comitatus, a chosen band bound to a leader by gift and promise. The pledge was simple, an absolute: eat at my table, share my danger, and I will clothe you in iron, feed your fame with gold, and portion you land when you've shown your worth. Talent rose faster here than birth alone, though fine ancestry and never hurt. A boy with quick eyes and a steady hand could stand nearer the fire each winter, his place in the hall shifting by feats, his bracelets heavier, his sword hilt thicker with pattern. He could earn the right to sleep beneath the roof beams instead of the eaves, to shout before others spoke, to cradle one of the great shields that formed the first line when lines were needed. That first line required tools as eloquent as the men who wielded them. When archaeologists open the earth along old river courses and on the slightly higher fields, they find the language of metal, spearheads long and leaf-shaped, bossed shields with iron hearts and ash wood rims worn smooth by hands, sword fragments that glitter, their cores welded from twisted bars so that light itself seems to move inside the blade. Pattern welding is not vanity, it makes steel tough and flexible, and the world surfaces double as beauty and warning. Jewelry tells its own story, brooches with interlace that seems to breathe. Filigree so fine it demands a craftsman's patience over many winters. An amber sun trapped in a stone brought along all the sea roads from the Baltic. Potters added quieter signatures. A village's clay remembered local water and temper. You can see hands adjusting the heat and humidity, pots turned this way or that, rims pinched or smoothed. Yet among these everyday shapes sit forms that mimic far-off fashions: a cup that copies a Roman curve, a jar with a glaze that tries for the glassy skin of provincial wares. Coins turn up, to imperial silver and bronze pierced as pendants, or hidden in graves, proof that Roman frontiers leaked commerce even when they bristled with soldiers. The dead explained the living. For generations, cremation served as the last heat a body would know. Ashes rested in urns whose surfaces carry the potter's thumbprint like a final touch. Fields of them lie in orderly rows, families gathered in soil as they were in life. Among them, sudden flashes of status, a warrior's grave where the weapons survived the pyre or were placed afterward, spear, shield fittings, maybe a sword, and a woman's resting place bright with beads and brooches, keys to cupboards that will not open again. On other plots, horse burials and stone settings shaped like ships speak of movement as destiny, of journeys imagined for the dead that mirror those of the living along river and sea. Religion threaded all of this with a steady hand. People honored powers in the world rather than above it, gods in oak shadows, goddesses in the curve of a fertile field, the uncanny hush on a bog that swallows a thrown spear without a sound, offerings worked metal twisted out of usefulness, animals given whole, perhaps even weapons taken from a fallen rival went into those thresholds where the waking world thins. When assemblies met in these places, politics acquired the gravity of ritual. Decisions sealed by sacrifice felt heavier than bargains made in a hall's smoky heat, because the confederation was more practice than parchment. It could flex. A war leader rose not by hereditary right alone, but because men believed he could bring them home and bring them back laden. A raid was not merely hunger dressed as courage. It was a test of networks. Who could call cousins downriver? Which hall's benches would empty at short notice? Who had a boat right with a new way to scarf a plank so a hull ran drier or turned quicker into a crosswind? Success hardened reputations into authority and authority into law. Failure could send a man to the benches near the door, where drafts remind you of your mistakes. The economy that fed this order was intimate and wide all at once. Households produced nearly everything they needed. Woven wool made dense against weather, linen bleached to a river's brightness, iron smelted from local bog ore and teased into tools by a smith whose hammer blows set the village's time. Yet strings of exchange stretched far. Tar and hides and salt fish left in boats that soon returned with glass beakers, bright as trapped sky, and copper alloy bowls that caught candlelight like stars. Traders traveled with a scale in small wooden boxes, pouring out weights like prayers before a deal. They knew which creek mouths were safe at neap tides and which sandbanks shifted treacherously after a storm. Boats deserve a chapter of their own, and our story begins it here. First came a practical craft dugouts hollowed from oak trunks, then planked boats whose ribs were steam-bent and lashed, flexible enough to ride a chop rather than fight it. A shallow draft let them slide over the braided shallows or nose upriver, past meadows and cows, to a landing place marked by a single pole. Then, slowly, a change in ambition hulls lengthened, seams caulked tighter with tarred hair, oars set on benches at measured intervals. There's a kind of knowledge a hand acquires by repeating the same motion for years. And along these coasts, hands learn to work with water's moods. Later, when Roman scribes complain of Saxon sails on the horizon, it will be these craftsmen's patient work that gave the wind something worthy to push. Roman voices, when they arrive, will be crisp and unamused. A geographer will flatten names into Greek and place the Saxons around Holstein as if putting pins into a map could hold them. Military reports will begin to mutter in the 3rd century about raiders who know the tides better than the officers who chase them. Forts will thicken along the Channel and the Kentish coast, and the new phrase Saxon Shore will enter the Latin of the bureaucracy. But in these earlier chapters, the line between trader and pirate is not a line at all, more a blur of intentions that depends on hunger, weather, and whether a gatekeeper's cousin once bartered fairly. For all their practicality, the Saxons kept a place for ceremony, and you can hear it when a leader swears men to him. An oath binds more than lips. It binds time. Gifts confirm it, arm rings heavy with promise. Fine blades that advertise their owner's generosity every time they catch the firelight. The hall's architect knows his psychology too. Pinches face inward so men see who sits beside whom. The high seat occupies the axis where attention naturally comes to rest. Food moves like a measured wave down the room. Meat and ale teaching a rhythm of expectation and reward. In such a setting, law becomes hospitality made durable, and hospitality becomes the front line of politics. None of this made them peaceful, but it made them patient. And patience is what a marginal landscape demands. Wet fields punish haste. Rivers teach that movement is not just force, but timing pushed too soon against a tide, and you exhaust yourself for nothing. No surprise, then, that Saxon politics could endure long stalls and sudden bursts, that warriors learned to hold a shield wall as if it were a field boundary too precious to lose, that assemblies could take a thing to exhaustion and still find a way to agree by sunset. In a world where water is an ally that can drown you, caution is not fear, it is wisdom. So, before we hear Roman alarms and watch the coastline bristle with new stone, remember this texture of life, the thing beneath branches, where law and holiness overlap, the comitatus, fire gilded with gifts and obligation, metal patterned like running water, urnfields that keep grandparents close, boats that hum under oars like living animals eager to run. A people able to live like this can learn to fight like this, and a people who can fight like this can cross water, find chances beyond the horizon, and return with stories and spoils that enlarge the world they left behind. A gray dawn lifts over the North Sea. In the half-light, a long, low hull slides between sandbanks, oars feathering in silence, a steersman tasting the tide on the air. What began as rivercraft, practical boats for ferrying grain, timber, and gossip has learned the sea's grammar. Planks now overlap in tight, patient rows. Ribs flex with the chop. The shallow keel kisses both creek and open water. Crews move like one animal. Somewhere beyond the haze lies a Roman fort that believes its walls can hear the future coming. Roman pens noticed the name first. A geographer copied it into a book, Saxons placing them on the boggy shoulders of Holstein, as if a line of ink could fence a people. Then, in the 3rd century's storms, officers began to mutter about them. Small notes at first, boats off a river mouth. A villa relieved of silver and survivors. Smoke seen where no smoke should be. The empire had larger fires to fight civil wars. New emperors each season, plague chewing through garrisons and the long northern frontier, once taut with watchfulness, sagged here and there. The Rhine's ramparts, which had once felt like the edge of the world, became a curtain with holes. The Saxons, never ones to ignore a current, slipped through. This was not a sudden change from farmer to pirate, from hearth to oar bench. It was a recalibration, a new way of measuring risk and harvest. When a village on an artificial mound has watched 3 bad summers wash away its margins, when a father must choose which field to save from salt and which to abandon to reeds, when traders bring fewer amphora and more rumors than the thing meets longer, the comitatus grows bolder and leaders begin to test distance. Raids opened as reconnaissance where are the shoals, the patrol patterns, the estates with storehouses. Patterns emerged. A tide running hard along a certain reach at dusk could carry a hull past a water station with no more sound than the sea's ordinary breathing. Fires lit in one direction could draw a cohort while the real landing happened 2 bays away. And always, if pressed, those longboats could retreat up a river too thin for Roman hulls. Archaeology, that is slow memory of soil, preserves the proof a sleek, clinker-built ship laid down in a Danish bog, its planks riveted tight, its length enough for 30 or 40 oarsmen to move a war band as quickly as a rumor. Such a vessel light, flexible, shallow-drafted needed neither grand harbors nor friendly tides, only a beach with packed sand and men trained to lift their weight together. You can imagine the training counting under breath, the drum in a helmsman's voice, the way arms learn to rest between strokes without losing rhythm. These were not accidents of wood. They were decisions made over decades by boatwrights who listened to water and weather and redesigned hope accordingly. Roman Britain felt the change most sharply along its soft underbelly. Villa owners who had lived like small kings with mosaics that told myths while their laborers threshed barley outside suddenly found that wealth is a beacon as much as a cushion. Storehouses became targets, harbors, doorways for trouble, monasteries, repositories of portable treasure and few swords. Saxon pirates, the reports called them, but the word pirate cheapens what was, by degrees, an industry. Scouts measured depths, memorized reef lines, and learned where cow paths met cart tracks behind the town. Fleets divided to strike at multiple points, denying Roman officers what they needed most time to gather to turn a handful of men into a line. Rome's answer hardened along the shingle a chain of forts whose very mass was a kind of argument. Walls thick enough to shame earthquakes, gatehouses layered like puzzles, harbors protected by new minted breakwaters, with towers tall as winter trees from which a watcher could read a horizon like a scripture. We know their names because stones keep them Richborough, Dover, Pevensey, Porchester, and because later centuries planted castles in their footprints as if to borrow authority from old foundations. Within those circuits, mixed garrisons, legionaries, sailors, men who had seen too many winters away from home kept uneasy company. Signal masts connected one fort's view to the next, and an officer with a wax tablet could, in theory, send warning faster than oars could beat a mile. In practice, the sea is a partisan. Fog misplaced signals, storms trimmed garrisons, and budgets ever more fragile meant some towers stood with fewer eyes than they claimed. The ramparts did blunt many blows. They taught raiders that patience is never idle, but the very attempt to solve the problem taught the Saxons more, which harbors were deep and which shoaled at the spring tides, where supply stores were placed, how long it took reinforcements to ride from one station to its neighbor. The forts defended, and in defending, they revealed. Meanwhile, on the far shore, the texture of life remained stubbornly familiar. Villages still hugged higher ground near rivers. Halls still oriented themselves to light and wind. Craft zones still smoked at the margins, where privacy allowed smiths their mysteries. If you sift those sites now, you find both continuity and change pit houses with weavers' weights, granaries on short posts, so rats must work for their mischief, and a scatter of imported luxuries, glass with a Roman lip, coins pierced to hang as amulets rather than kept as money. Trade did not die, it adapted. North Sea routes braided themselves tighter, and a man who had once sold hides for salt might now sell iron rivets for planks and return with a small beaker whose translucence made an entire hall lean forward. Religion still framed the calendar, but the gods heard different prayers. Ritual deposit in bogs did not cease. If anything, they grew more eloquent. A spear bent before it was given useless in this world, so that it might be useful in another. A torque twisted and hurled into black water, where the air smells of old leaves and iron. Oaths gained new edges. To swear to a leader now was to stake not only the harvest's safety, but the chance of a voyage's profit. The promise that your wife's bracelet would be heavier next winter, that your name would be called first when land somewhere, anywhere, was to be portioned. That last word land pulled like a lodestone. Beyond raids lay something slower and more consequential movement with the intention to stay. We feel it first as pressure, not as plans. Population nudged at the limits of what damp fields could give. Weather turned capricious, stacking poor seasons like a gambler who has forgotten when to stop. Elsewhere in Europe, more distant peoples jostled west, and their elbows hit neighbors who struck their own until the ripple found the German Ocean. You cannot see a domino fall in a marsh, but you can count abandoned farmsteads where sand drifted in and hearths went cold in a single season. Some closures were tragedy, some were a strategy. The thing, when it met and measured these truths, began to bless departures. On the Roman side, the Rhine old shield of the West grew porous, then riddled. Legions pulled away to solve emergencies nearer the purple. Line soldiers muttered about pay. Officers counted forts that needed twice the men they had. Against this fraying, Saxon bands first probed, then pressed. Raids became campaigns. Fleets assembled not from desperation, but from calculation, with leaders who thought in seasons, not in nights, and the empire, as it had so often, answered with bargains as well as blades. Foederati, they called them Saxon groups, brought into Roman pay, given land on terms, sworn to fight other barbarians in exchange for money, grain, and a lawful place to stand. Some took the bargain and learned the empire from the inside, its strengths, its silences, its habit of teaching neighbors how to become problems. All of this had costs not written in annals. Coastal trade, once a chain of predictable exchanges, kinked and frayed. Merchants detoured inland at expense and risk. Villas near the sea either sprouted ditches and palisades or saw their owners sell off mosaic dreams for safer hills. Communities nearest the water negotiated, bought time with tribute, or assembled militias that could at best, discourage the small bands and die in front of the large ones. The sum was an ache felt along shorelines, fewer fishing boats out at dawn, more lookouts on dunes, more smoke in the distance that no one ran to investigate, because running meant leaving your own roof undefended, and yet listen under the anxiety, and you hear the same steadiness that shaped part 2 of our walk. The Saxons did not abandon their confederation instincts. They sharpened them. Calls went out not only for arms, but for specialists, carpenters, who could raise a palisade in a day, shipwrights who could caulk a seam in a storm, women who could turn a wet fleece into warmth before nightfall, smiths who could re-edge a blade between one landing and the next. The thing still met, but now maps drawn in the air with fingers played a larger role than quarrels over cattle. Law still ruled, but it ruled toward the sea as well as toward the field. By the century's end, patterns had hardened. Rome had forts whose shadows fell across shingle and salt grass. The Saxons had fleets that treated those shadows as navigational aids. Along the coast glimmered a new professional class, the pilot who knew a shoal by the color of the water, the interpreter who could turn Latin shouts into something useful, the negotiator who could make a monastery surrender its portable wealth without anyone bleeding on the altar steps. And behind them, in the old homelands of marsh and meadow, households still cooked porridge at dawn, still mended fences, still set a seat at the fire for those who had gone out, and if the tide and fortune agreed, would come back again. Soon, invitations would come from across the sea, polite at first, desperate later, asking for Saxon muscle to solve British problems that Romans no longer essayed to answer, but that belongs to the next watch of the night. For now, hold this image: a coastline armored in stone, a horizon flecked with hulls, low as seals and twice as quick, and between them a wind that carries words in 2 languages, both of them learning, sentence by sentence, what it means when geography turns into destiny. Across the northern marches of empire, the 3rd century felt like a ship taking water faster than the crew could bail. The Rhine, that the stern frontier Rome had taught itself to trust, no longer behaved like a wall, it behaved like a river again, crossable when the ice came early, fordable where the watchtowers stood empty, negotiable by men who knew mud as a map. The Saxon war bands that had learned night tide and shoal now learned opportunity. At first, they touched the edges, testing a gate, a grain boat, a barn fat with last year's taxes, and they slipped away before the reports could walk upriver. Then the pattern thickened fleets that parted like a shoal of fish to strike 2, 3 places at once. Rendezvous points marked by a crooked alder. Signals practiced so often that fear could not spoil them. It would be comforting to declare this a sudden conversion from landfolk to sea wolves. It wasn't. It was a society adjusting angles, the same households, the same crafts, the same assemblies, only now the calendar had sea days alongside sowing and harvest, and the thing weighed not just fields, but variable plunder and the price of risk. In the homelands, you still find granaries lifted on posts and halls framed in oak, but you also find more boat rivets in the ash middens and a different kind silence the quiet that houses keep when a portion of their men are away. Rome, for its part, answered with a stone. The Saxon Shore is our name for it now, a chain of coastal works whose bulk argued as loudly as their garrisons did softly at Richborough, Dover, Pevensey, Portchester. The very syllables sound like teeth. You could run a hand along walls meant to ignore ladders and mock fire. 20 feet and more of masoned wool. Gates layered so an intruder could lose his courage before he lost his way. Harbors armored with curving breakwaters where patrol boats could rock and wait. Inside, you'd meet a broth of men regulars and sailors, veterans of Danube winters, provincials who had forgotten the smell of their home soil. Signal masts linked horizon to horizon. Pilots kept tide books in their heads. It worked often enough to matter. It failed often enough to teach the raiders everything forts never intend to teach, where depth waits within a stone's throw of shore, which a station goes dark when pay is late, how long it takes a relief column to ride from one carved inscription to the next. Meanwhile, the slow pressures that change continents were doing their quiet work in peat and pollen. When archaeologists lift cores from old bog water, the record speaks in grains first, the heavy hand of clearance. Forests thinned and fields pushed into soils that would give if coaxed. Then a stutter growth, rings that narrow, seasons that falter, coastlines that creep where they should retreat. In those same layers, someone flattened a field of rye and never harvested it, a village left behind its cornstones and a child's wooden toy, as if they had meant to come back next week and somehow never did. The story is not famine alone, it is arithmetic more mouths than the land could bear in poor years. Old enmities rehearsed on a stage where the exits narrowed. Rumors from the east were riders without kings, unseated kings without riders. Call it the Hunnic shudder if you like. Names don't change the fact that pressure travels, jarring one group and then the next until the vibration finds the sea. The Saxon answer to all this was to become more amphibious and more deliberate. Shipwrights made choices that revealed themselves even after centuries. In a bog, planks overlapped and clenched with iron. Ribs set to flex with swell instead of fight it. Keels shallow enough to drink a river and honest enough to brave a chop. A longboat of 70 feet and more could carry 30 or 40 oarsmen and enough armed men to cow a coast. It could be beached and then hand-carried above tide line before a horse could catch its breath. It could vanish into a reed bed and sleep, hull to mud, while a detachment scouted a villa's stores and counted the swine by the sound they made. These were not toys of desperation, they were tools of a new economy. Raiding, too, professionalized. Scouting parties learned where shoals turned cruel at ebb and kind at flood, which estuary gave a back door to a wealthy district, where the road a farmer used to cart wood met the track a tax collector used to avoid attention. Villas with mosaic floors became predictable banks. Monasteries, repositories of light, books, and plate were poorly garrisoned and spiritually resigned to martyrdom they hoped would never be asked of them. The method hardened a smoke in the west to pull a garrison one way, hulls gliding out of the morning in the east while the watch counted a smoke. When the steel was needed, it came in quick bursts, get in, get out, avoid the kind of fight that writes itself into epitaphs, and when a cohort did arrive, shields closed and oars bit. Those longboats walked up the nearest river until pursuit expired in deeper water and thicker reeds. South along the Channel and across to Gaul, the pattern repeated. Only the rivers were grander and the prizes closer to imperial bone. The Seine and the Loire behaved exactly as a Saxon helmsman asks a river to behave tide-fed highways by day, in draft-lulled hiding places by night. Fortified harbors and river towers forced different calculations, but the raiders adapted scouts ahead on the bank, a reserve boat already turned for flight, bridges tested for whether a single axeman could hold a span long enough to let his brothers ashore. The enemy never estayed one shape. Where a villa had fallen twice, its owner moved inland or lined his walls with men whose hands were more loyal than skilled. Where a port had suffered, officials raised their harbor chains and taxed their merchants to pay for new ones. The sea watched this dialogue and shrugged. It has room for both argument and exit. Rome also tried a different remedy: contracts instead of campaigns. Foederati partners was the official word, as comforting as a legal seal. Saxon war bands entered imperial hire, granted rations and coin and a legal patch of earth if they would spend their fury on Rome's other problems. Some kept the bargain and learned to salute in Latin. Some learned faster lessons, the empire's depots, the paths its couriers took, how grain is counted when the counting matters. Nothing teaches you the shape of a house like sleeping in its kitchen. All of this battered shore economies beyond the obvious losses. Traders learned to price in danger. The margin that used to pay a son's dowry now paid for a militia that might stand for an hour and run before noon. The comfortable geometry of coastal life, fishers out at first light, smoke from salt pans by mid-morning, a brisk exchange at the quays before dusk grew hesitant. Inland routes grew busier, costlier, and crueler to the hooves that walked them. Some communities bargained a certain amount of grain left at a certain tree meant the next landing would pass them by. Others doubled their ditches and discovered what men discover when they spend the nights on walls. They begin to hope for an enemy worthy of the lost sleep and to dread the one they'll actually get. At home, the Confederation did not dissolve under these new habits. It rearticulated itself. Charismatic leadersmen proved in weather and at the oar as much as at the thing learned to call not only warriors but specialists. A wall of shields means little if the palisade behind it sags. A boat is only as bold as its caulking is fresh. Women's labor, already the spine of subsistence, now became the spine of mobility, weaving sails stout enough to take a squall and light enough for men to haul down and run with, dyeing cloth that could mark a man's allegiance across a foggy creek, provisioning with a speed that let a fleet steal an extra tide. Smiths stood in the doorway between field and sea one day, reforging a shire. The next, rebidding a seax, dulled on Roman mail. Migration, when it came, did not feel like a banner unfurled so much as a series of return trips that failed to return. A raiding party left boys behind to winter with kin in a friendly village over the water. In a spring, those boys had new words in their mouths, new appetites for land shaped differently. A leader took a contract with a British ruler who promised provisions and a wedge of coastline. The contract stretched to a year, then to a generation, and beneath that, the arithmetic again. If a marsh yields less than it did, and your cousin writes back that the soil there breaks easily under an ox. How long before there becomes home in your wife's mouth? It would be tidy to pretend there was unanimity about any of this. There wasn't. Old men remembered winters when the ice locked every creek and said the climate had always played tricks. Halls argued over whether honor lived in guarding the mound your grandfather raised or in seizing a better ridge elsewhere. But law is a living thing, and it turned its face toward the new work. Assemblies began to keep track not just of fines and blood prices, but of who had rights to what beech, which oaks could be felled for hulls, how to divide spoils so that next year's crews would be larger, not smaller. The warrior oath tightened its weave, more men bound to more leaders by more strands land promises. Marriage ties, a share in ships. By the mid-5th century, 3 currents joined into one tide. First, the empire's coastal shield was more a scar than skin. Second, the North Sea highway felt as familiar as a market road. Third, across the water, the island's Roman habits were collapsing into local arguments, and local arguments breed invitations. Come and fight for us. The letters began to say, some written, some carried in the mouths of envoys, and we will feed you, arm you, and grant you a place. The Saxons had been many things by then: farmers, traders, hired swords, uninvited guests, and they recognized an old bargain wearing new clothes. A few ships would test the promise, then a few more. Behind them, in the homelands, mothers packed small bags for daughters who would not return, and the thing accounted for absences as if they were seed cast on a wind that knows its own field. Soon, names would fix themselves to a story's vortigern, and 2 brothers whose fame is all sail and little keel, but before the proper chronicle begins. Notice the ground already prepared men who could cross in a night and fight at dawn, leaders who could argue their men into taking land, not just loot, households that could turn a landing into a village before the moon changed. The next chapter opens with an invitation. Yes, but the pen that writes it has been sharpened for years. They say it began with an invitation, though the parchment has long since turned to dust. A British king Vortigern, in most tellings, looked north to Pictish raids and south to failing Roman walls, then across the water to a people who understood tides and the price of a blade. 3 ships under brothers Hengist and Horsa moored at Thanet, where the chalk bites the sea. Hired service soon widened into something harder to reverse land in place of rations. Winter quarters that did not get packed away. Archaeology speaks where chronicles argue. In Kent, graves at Fingalsham and Sara say more than any flourish of Latin. Spears and shields shaped along continental lines lie beside brooches a Saxon woman would recognize, and crucially, children's graves among them. War bands do not bury toddlers with beads unless women and hearths have crossed as well. The urns and inhumations run in fields used for generations. Continuity only permanent settlement makes. Cemeteries sit just beyond the last house, close enough for memory, far enough for reverence. Patterns on the earth show a mind at work. New communities gravitate to ridges above river valleys, close enough to draw water and float a boat, high enough to see a stranger coming. Distances repeat with a regularity that does not happen by accident. each site a morning's walk from the next, close enough to call for help, far enough that fields do not quarrel. You can read a defensive calculus in that spacing, and an agrarian one too. The first seasons still look mercenary as stockaded camps, a share of plunder from coastal raids turned into bride goods and cattle. But the material language becomes domestic quickly. Clay-tempered the way it was back in Holstein gives way, within a generation, to local clays and styles, proof that potters tohacked across hedgerows, pig bones thicken in middens where sheep had been the rule, and barley claims marginal plots at choices that mark a new palette and a new arithmetic of survival. The old texts put names to the transition with theatrical simplicity banquets, bargains, a quarrel over unpaid stipends, Kent carved out as reward or hostage. Somewhere within the drama lies a practical truth. A British ruler traded acres for service, and the holders of those acres organized them with more than opportunism. High-status burials, with swords laid along the right side and imported trinkets glowing in the dark, announce local leadership and stratified communities. From Kent, the settlement map widens. Lines of new farmsteads run toward the South Downs, along rivers that open the country like zippers. Ouse, Adur, Arran, where places like Bishopstone and Rookery Hill show houses raised to meet English weather, not continental winters. Timber framing adjusts to different spans. Daub mixes change because the chalk here demands it. Yet Saxon habits persist, the elongated hall with its gable door, outbuildings aligned like a sentence that has learned a new dialect but keeps its old grammar. In Essex, the picture is more braided. At Mucking, a sprawl of a sunken featured buildings and post-built halls preserves a town in motion. Romano-British layout and Germanic craft make a handshake rather than a duel. You can stand above a pit house that held a loom and look across to a building whose plan a Roman surveyor would have sketched. Pottery from both worlds sleeps in the same layer. The impression is not of one people vanishing, but of tools and words learning each other's edges. Underlying it all is a martial backbone. Even while cows are counted and hedges laid, graves retain spears and shields in numbers that remind us this was conquest as well as colony. The pattern of weapon graves suggests retinues sworn bands around local lords, their oaths stitched to gifts and land. Yet the fearsome is not the only index of status. Beads bright as a river at noon and filigreed brooches speak of women at the center of this new society, carrying taste, memory, and alliance in what they wore. What of the people already here? The soil keeps their names poorly, but it keeps their habits. River names and hill names remain stubbornly older than the newcomers. In the stratigraphy of rubbish pits, some dishes are made the Roman way long after Roman taxes ceased, and some buildings keep a Roman width because the foundations are already there. In the Thames Valley especially, the weave is tight-hand-made Saxon pottery beside mortar robbed from a villa wall. Religion sits at a juncture. Cemeteries show cremations in urns patterned with Germanic spirals. A few paces away lie inhumations aligned to the sun, a habit more at home with Christian hopes. A pendant cross turns up in a grave otherwise full of pagan amulets. The tidy explanations that here a missionary preached. They're a pagan revival probably undersell the fact that belief moves through families the way other traditions do, slowly, with exceptions and compromises that fit around marriages and harvests. By the close of the 5th century, the political weather has changed. What had been a patchwork of federate bands and anxious British courts begins to crystallize into recognizably Saxon territories. Kent is no longer merely a place where Saxons happen to live. It grows a grammar kings whose names run in lines, a court that draws traders overseas, laws remembered and eventually written. Sussex and Essex developed their own patterns, cousins more than twins, and inland up the Thames, a new power gathers around Dorchester-on-Thames, seat of the realm the future will call Wessex. None of this is a clean sweep, where guilds still echo British custom. A church squats on a site where an oak once held prayers. A market day ignores ethnic arithmetic because honey is honey and iron is iron. At West Stowe in Suffolk, the grid of sunken featured buildings huddles by water meadows, a hall, a workshop, a buyer, the kit of a community. If you climb a ridge and look down at the distribution of halls and fields, you can see the new geometry. It belongs to people who live by rivers and sea lanes, hold ground with a shield wall when needed, and plant for children who will never see the continent their grandparents left. The brothers in the Legion fade quickly after their splashy entrance, which is often the way of founding stories. What persists are the habits their coming accelerated, the tightening of kin into lordships, the apprenticeship of craft across cultures, the confidence to claim a line on the map as more than an encampment. Britain did not empty, it changed its posture. The Saxons did not arrive as a single nation. They became one by staying. And as the 5th century turns, invitations grow fewer, not because the need for swords disappears, but because the Saxons now write their own terms. For a season, the wind turned, and the island pushed back, not with a single miracle or a king out of legend, but with farms that held their lines, hilltops bristling again with timber, and a leader whom a stern British writer named simply Ambrosius Aurelianus, Gildas, who loved admonition more than a story, calls him a survivor of Roman stock, a man who gathered the remnants and taught them, once more, to stand. The Saxon advance, which had crept along river mouths and lowland ridges like brine through turf, met something older and suddenly awake. Archaeology shows the country buckling its belt again. Across the west and north, long slumbering hill forts stirred. Cadbury Castle in Somerset, South Cadbury to modern maps thickened its ramparts. Spines of earth faced with timber and stone, gatehouses narrowed to control a crush of shields. Inside those encircling banks, post holes sketch big halls in which councils could be called and oaths traded. Corn dryers glow red in the soil, hinting at grain stored to withstand a siege. Elsewhere, ramparts were escarped and recut, causeways sharpened into kill zones, the practical grammar of a people who expected visitors with axes. This was no simple retrenchment into the hills. Rich peninsulas and headlands on the western shores, already braided into Atlantic trade, flashed with imported goods. At Tintagel, cliff and spray cradle, a high status site where broken amphorae from Mediterranean ships, once heavy with wine and oil, lie thick as shells after a storm. There is the feel of a court, their metalwork fine enough to pay a war band. writing enough to draw a priest. Across the Severn, at Dinas Powys, aristocratic refuse sparkles glass sherds, gilt fittings suggesting tables laid with the spoils of far roots. Whatever Rome had been, its ghost still sent gifts by sea to British hands, and those hands paid fighters and masons to hold the line. Ambrosius does not astride our pages with a crown. He appears the way resilient things do in hard times, less as a person than as a practice gathering, training, judging. The British kings of hill and vale began to act together. On ridges scarred by old ditches, they stacked fresh timbers. In valleys, they drilled spear lines. When raids came, watchers on recut ramparts sent down horn blasts through wet air, and men climbed with shields that had not seen battle for a generation. The story is not of one perfect charge, but of enough sharp answers that raiders reconsidered and settlers stayed behind palisades. From these years grew the brightest reflection of them all. The Arthur we inherit through later tellers is all gold and miracle, but the root note is simpler, a war leader, someone who could make men from more than one kingdom move together, someone who could choose his ground at Glastonbury and on windswept ridges elsewhere. The archaeology of the late 5th and early 6th centuries shows high status occupation, imported goods, and workshop traces not proof of a single man, but signs of linked courts able to coordinate effort, reward faithfulness, and carry memory. The legend magnifies, the soil whispers of logistics. Gildas gives us a battle at a place he calls Badon. The location is contested hills near Bath. Some argue, others point elsewhere, but the effect, even in his unsentimental account, is unmistakable. The Saxon tide checked. There followed, he says, years of relative calm. Not universal peace, frontiers still smoked. Small wars still burned along their edges, but a reprieve long enough to sharpen plowshares and repair barns, long enough for children born into siege to marry into years of planting. The archaeology syncs with that quiet. In eastern cemeteries, the ratio of weapon graves dips. In the West, British pottery styles continue with a stubborn pride. In between, horizons blur. You can see agricultural intensification in the record new field systems carved. More granaries sunk, more oxen's bones telling of heavy plows dragging iron through clay. In sunken featured buildings on the Saxon side, loom weights pile up like small moons, a sign that households turned inward to spin, weave, and trade. At the same time, the highest status British sites keep receiving those amphorae. Somebody still had the ships and the contacts to order wine by the jar and dress tables, with a mind to display. The pause did not undo what had been done. Saxon communities in Kent, Sussex, Essex, and along the Thames did not melt back across the sea. They hedged their fields and repaired their halls, made marriages and markets, and learned their neighbors' seasons. In the Thames Valley, especially Dorchester on the Thames and its ring of farmsteads, you can watch a future Wessex begin to recognize itself, not by deeds of conquest, but by each winter that it survives intact. Essex, meanwhile, shows the braid-tightening sunken huts for weaving and smithing sit near buildings planned in Romano-British fashion. The cemetery includes both brooch types and prayer habits from two traditions. It looks in the ground, less like invader and invaded than like a gradient. Religion walked that gradient carefully. British churches kept their rounds, basilicas in certain towns maintained rites, even as their stonework was robbed to patch new walls. In Saxon cemeteries, you still find cremation urns with stamped spirals, but more graves now stretch west-east, the heads to meet the sun like a congregation newly risen. A hanging cross might sit among beads that still whispered the names of older gods. Conversion here was not a shout, but a long, low conversation, hearth to hearth, winter to winter. If the British moment under Ambrosius and his successors drew its strength from cooperation and prepared ground, so too did its limits. The old confederation of Western courts held while leaders were as strong and messages fast. But to the east and south, Saxon lordships matured. They minted authority with gift-giving and judgment, pulled in craftsmen and distant traders. Kent, under a line of kings whose names would one day be written, became as much a gate to the Frankish world as a sword point into British lands. Sussex and Essex hardened into territories with their own habits and laws. What Badon granted was time for both sides. For the Saxons, that time produced a different kind of power. The big halls at the cores of settlements became stable addresses. Craft neighborhoods grew beside them smiths, whose hands knew pattern welding well enough to make not just war blades, but tools in number. Potters who learned local clays so intimately that their work rings unmistakably of place. In the West, British centers continued to command prestige courts with Mediterranean taste, hill forts that were more than refuges, administrative hearts, where tribute was counted and justice argued. Amid this balance, lines of earth appear long banks and ditches, scratching the landscape like old scars, work that some have read as boundary making, a way of declaring where protection applied and where a lord's summons held. Whether thrown up by British hands or Saxon, these earthworks speak to a new sensibility, not just raiding and reaction, but the drawing of jurisdictions. When the 6th century ripened, the ledger of expansion changed its handwriting. New Saxon settlements did not push outward at the same pace. Instead, the existing ones thickened. Fields were subdivided. Livestock counts grow in the bones left behind. Storage pits proliferate. Agricultural intensification is the archaeologist's phrase it feels, in more human terms, like hope measured in bushels. On the British side, Highland strongholds do not vanish, but some show signs of decline as courts shift to lower, more commercially connected sites. Trade does not stop at a language border. It eddies where profit and safety allow, so the island drew breath. In stories, the calm after Badon belongs to a single champion. In the dirt, it belongs to the stubbornness of families, to leaders who could make neighbor kingdoms share burdens, to imported wine poured into British cups to sweeten negotiations, to Saxon lords who discovered that governing was more nourishing than burning. No event sealed the peace, and none guaranteed its longevity. It was a window, opened by steel and held ajar by policy. When it closed, as windows do the peoples who faced one another along rivers and hedge lines were altered. The Saxons were no longer an arriving people but a settled one, ready to speak of kingship and law. The Britons were no longer Roman in memory only. They had built a post-Roman order with its own strengths, eager to bargain, quick to rally. From that equilibrium, The next turn would come early kingdoms coalescing like stars from a nebula. Kent articulate and outward-looking, Sussex flinty and martial, Essex braided and pragmatic, and farther west, a power that would call itself West Saxon, patient as winter, looking toward a future that could not be guessed from any rampart. The lull after Badon became a crucible. Out of that tempered quiet, 4 English polities took clearer shape, Kent facing the Channel with a merchant's gaze, Sussex taut and flinty along the southern downs, Essex braided to the estuaries of the Thames, and gathering itself farther west, the people who would call their realm Wessex. None of these arose in a dawn trumpet blast. They thickened out of markets that met on set days, courts where disputes were weighed against memory, and halls where a lord's generosity could turn men into kin. Kent stood first among near equals. Its shoreline was not a frontier so much as a hinge, one swing toward Frankish lands, another back to Britain's interior. The kings who ruled at Canterbury learned early that gifts flowing in and out of that hinge wine, glass, garnet, silk, coin, could be shaped into legitimacy. We hear the name Ethelbert and see a court that is oddly cosmopolitan. For the age, a king married to a Christian Frankish princess, Bertha, whose chapel and clerics came with her, craftsmen invited by privilege, merchants who knew the terms of 3 measures and the temper of 3 seas. In such a place, law could be written. The Kentish code that bore Ethelbert's name did not erase custom. It captured it in clauses and fines, wereguilds calibrated to rank, compensations for harm to eye or limb, schedules for theft and harboring, so that authority might travel beyond the sound of a single voice. It is as if the kingdom put down in words what had long lived in memory, and by writing made it exportable. Material culture mirrors that confidence. Kentish brooches set with garnets glare like little suns from graves. Filigree work shows hands sure of their art. Glass beakers, thin as birdsong, break often in the ground because they broke often in life, delicate things used at tables where a status required risk. At Leminge and other sites, timber halls stand beside sunken featured buildings where women's labor turned wool into wealth. The port towns on shingle and creek, some old Roman harbors renewed, some new served as the kingdom's lungs, drawing in breath from Gaul and exhaling it inland as prestige. Sussex tells a different story in the soil. The South Saxon downs give what they have only to those who learn them, a hard pasture, a deeply folded chalk. Settlements line rivers that cut to the sea. Hilltops above them bear the stubborn lineaments of forts and lookouts. Here the ruler's toolkit remains frankly martial a little longer. Assemblies that are part war muster, part court, burial assemblages where the spear and shield still speak loudly for a household's honor, yet even here the quiet work of a stability went on. Pottery wheels hummed, smiths forged plowshares as readily as spearheads, and at Bishopstone, a high-status site reoccupied, the presence of imported pieces glass, perhaps a brooch from across the water, hints at channels of exchange threading through the apparent severity. Essex is neither as frank a military frontier as Sussex, nor as outward-facing as Kent. It is, instead, a braid old Roman lines reused and Germanic customs overlaid. In East Saxon ground, Archaeologists find settlements with Romano-British planning alongside the sunken workshops of newcomers, farmsteads whose field systems inherit Roman discipline, a habit of administration that looks, even in its gaps, like memory persisting. Most important is the Thames, whose tide pulls wealth toward it like the moon pulls sea. The East Saxon kings could lay claim to the prestige of London, sometimes thin and haunted, where Roman walls cast long shadows, sometimes bustling, where a later emporium would grow. Their power seems to have turned on managing that river's traffic, collecting dues, ensuring roads held, and keeping peace enough for traders to risk the journey. Farther west, the valley of the Thames widened its elbows, and there, among gravel terraces and slow waters, a different center cohered. Dorchester-on-Thames appears in the record as a node where territory could be counted and commanded. Around it and southward, the ring of farmsteads and craft hamlets that we name Proto-Wessex learned the slow arts of resilience, dividing field in ways that keep soil strong, breeding cattle for draw as well as meat, setting aside as stores against thin years. The weapon graves did not vanish. West Saxon lords gave rings and took oaths in the old way, but we see more storage pits, more loom weights, more iron tools. This is a society rehearing the argument that prosperity, if distributed with ceremony and recorded with care, can purchase a steadier kind of safety than raiding ever did. What bound these early realms was not a stone or script alone, but performance. A king or ealdorman was the man who could fill a hall in winter, feed every guest, and make the gift that bound the best fighter to the worst year. He was also the man who could sit in judgment with measured speech, set the fine not to humiliate but to reconcile, and then remember at the next assembly what had been agreed. The law codes that begin to appear first in Kent, later elsewhere, read like the written memory of those performances, where they would specify the value of a tooth or the penalty for striking a woman. They do not invent order, they fix it in place so that order can travel. Across all 4 regions, you can watch power professionalize. In cemeteries, the richest graves cluster signs of families becoming houses. In settlements, clusters of specialized buildings appear, smithies with slag piled like small hills, kilns set apart for firing pottery, buyers built to overwinter more animals. Trade webs tighten cornerstones from distant quarries show up in our kitchens. Amber from the Baltic glows in our necklaces. Frank's gold tremises find their way to English hands, then back again as raw metal recast. Each exchange implies someone to guarantee it, and, in guaranteeing, to govern. And yet these kingdoms are not copies. The temperament of terrain and the nearness of old Rome endure. Kent measures in coin and clause. Sussex measures in muster and land walk. Essex in the levy of its river route and the reuse of civic bones. Wessex in granary and lineage. Where Romano-British communities remained dense, as in parts of Essex, accommodation was practical old field systems, and villa sites became the scaffolding for new authority. Where Rome's imprint was lighter, as in Sussex, leadership leaned longer on the theater of arms, even as it learned to count cattle with the same gravity it counted spears. Religion threaded quietly through these changes. In East and South Saxon graves, cremation gives way unevenly to inhumation aligned with the rising sun, Brooches and beads lie beside small crosses. A bishop's staff does not yet command, but a priest's whispered Latin begins to mix with Germanic verse. In Kent, the presence of a Christian queen ensured that altars did not lack for candles. In Wessex, the memory of British holy places persisted along river bends and on hilltops. No trumpet-blowing conversion happens yet. Rather, a gradual embers to coals movement prepares the hearth for a brighter flame to come. What mattered most in these years was the invention of confidence. Fewer fortnights spent under arms, more court days spent laying fines and exchanging sureties. The same ships that once brought raiders now ferried merchants. The same swords that bought land now guarded it. The same gods that had favored victory now, under new names, in new places, were asked to favor peace. Even the dead, conspired in stability cemeteries, used over generations, stitched memory to parish and place, telling the living where they belonged and who would answer for them if they erred. Beyond their horizons, other forces were gathering rival courts in the north, welding Bernicia to Dara, Midland peoples beginning to speak with one Mercian voice, but for a span. The south and east practiced the art of rule within borders that held Kent's written law, Sussex's hard-learned watchfulness, Essex's hybrid habits, Wessex's knack for patience together. They created a grammar for kingship that others would borrow and amplify. The men who sat in those timber halls could not see the heptarchy yet. They could see only their neighbors, their roads, their winter stores, and the sea that brought either trouble or opportunity depending on the wind. But by holding their own, by writing what they held, they made it possible for the island's next age of overlords and ship burials, bishops and scholars to imagine itself on firmer ground. Soon a monk from Rome would step ashore with letters and a mission, and a northern court would hang shields on its walls like suns. Soon the word Britwalda would be said with interest and caution. But first, it mattered that these early kingdoms learned to lost each in its own voice, all speaking the new political language of the English. On a mild spring day in 597, sails showed like gulls off Thanet, and with them came a quiet alteration of time. The monk Augustine stepped ashore carrying letters, relics, a choir that could fold Latin into air, and a permission slip signed by power Rome's confidence affixed to a Kentish problem. King Ethelbert received him warily, in the open, where magic could not be trapped beneath a roof. But the danger he weighed was not sorcery. It was politics. Across from him stood a mission, protected, at least in claim, by St. Peter. Beside him stood Queen Bertha, a Frankish Christian whose chapel at St. Martin's already chimed a different hour within Canterbury's timber streets. Ethelbert understood trade winds and tides. He knew that new gods often rode in the wake of useful friends. Conversion in Kent did not arrive like lightning. It seeped like morning through shutters. The first baptisms touched the royal circle, because authority, then as now, likes to spread from the center. Augustine's men raised altars where Roman walls still lingered and patched them with scavenged brick. Their stone churches a deliberate contrast to the wooden halls of kings. They sang the hours and made good neighbors, and when they asked for land, they received it in careful gifts, estates marked by rivers and oaks, by meadows and mills, places where a monastery could feed itself and, more importantly, feed the poor on feast days. The charters that recorded such grants taught the English hand how to hold a pen. A king who put cross to parchment gained a memory larger than any man's. A bishop who kept that parchment gained a lever on the king. Ethelbert's other great writing was secular, though nothing in that age stayed entirely apart from sanctity. His law code, the first in any Germanic vernacular, set values to injury and reconciliation with a precision that suggests long practice now fixed in ink. A tooth, an eye, an oath broken, a spear brandished, a slave wounded, each had its price, graded by the rank of the harmed and the harmer, so that peace could be bought before vengeance consumed a village. The code looks, at first glance, like arithmetic. Read with the ear and it becomes drama a script for turning blood into silver and silver into continued life. Christianity's emphasis on penance and compensation harmonized with this calculus. Between altar and assembly, a shared language of making right took shape. Kent's advantage in these years was to speak readily with the continent. On the Estranad rich borough and in the creeks of the Wansum, ships from Frankish ports unloaded amphorae and glass. Smiths and goldsmiths learned patterns and tools from across the narrow sea, translating them into brooches bright as small fires and buckles that made hands look wealthy. Coin, too, passed back and forth, thin gold tremises stamped with foreign kings. Later, new issues bearing English names. In graves near Canterbury and Faversham, necklaces of garnet and amethyst clasped the throats of women whose households organized more wealth than war. None of this was charity. It was policy expressed in objects. A ruler who drew merchants to his market could turn exotic into authority. Overlordship followed prosperity's wake. Bede, writing later, would list a sequence of Bretwaldas, English rulers whose influence stretched beyond their native shires. Among them he placed Ella of Sussex and Ceawlin of Wessex, names with the ring of earlier, more flint-edged days. But in Ethelbert of Kent he recognized a new style of supremacy. The Kentish king's power ran not only on spears and the old obligation of the war band, but on ports, priests, and paper. He could convene councils where bishops sat beside ealdormen. He could send missionaries outward to London, where Mellitus tried to plant a see, to Rochester with Eustace, deeper still as fortunes permitted. Influence became a network, river mouths, road junctions, royal halls, and new stone sanctuaries threaded together. The story did not move in a straight line. When Ethelbert died, some of those outward plants withered. In East Saxon lands, the Christian bishop was driven out, and the high places called their audiences home. A church without a king to guard it was just another building. A king without a church to praise him had to pay for glory in more traditional coin. The fragility matters. It reminds us that conversion was not merely a matter of believing different things. It required rearranging calendars, redistributing land, and teaching the young to read. It meant sanctifying wells and groves so that the old spirits had new names, and asking families to bury their dead with their heads to the west, looking east, because resurrection was not a vague hope, but a scheduled promise. Even so, the Roman mission's logic was compelling. It offered a hierarchy that mirrored kingdoms: archbishop over bishops, bishop over priests, priests over parishes, and while that hierarchy cared most for souls, it proved very helpful for governance. If you can write down who owes what to whom, you can tax. If you can date a grant in the Xth year of King so-and-so on the feast of this saint, you can find your way back through argument. If you can standardize the rite that blesses a crown, you can standardize the expectation that crowns should be blessed. In Canterbury, Augustine's successors built up libraries and schools. Boys learned to shape Latin syllables and to cut quills, and thereby kingdoms learned to shape time itself, to keep Easter by a computus rather than by harvest lore, to file charters by regnal year, to think in decades and generations. Around this Kentish heart, neighboring polities adjusted. In Sussex, where the chalk ridges trained minds toward vigilance and economy, royal sanctity could bolster a rougher politics, smoothing relations with fractious sub-kings. In Essex, where London's prestige tempted every power that could claim it, the presence of a bishop with continental friends could help stabilize a contested seat. In Wessex, still more valley than nation, the first episcopal centers mapped influence along the Thames and into the towns, so that religion's roads became the kingdom's roads. The result was not uniformity, but alignment, a gradual tuning so that when one polity tightened or slackened power, the others heard it in their own strings. Material traces show the weave. Roman bricks appear, reused in chancels and apses, timber halls raise side chapels, cemeteries shift from cremation urn fields to rows of inhumations aligned with the sun. Grave goods diminish, then return in subtler ways: a small cross, a gospel hinge, a buckle with a new geometry. In workshops, bronzes acquire interlace inspired by manuscript art. In manuscripts, beasts from old Germanic ornament slither into letters shaped by Mediterranean tradition. The island was not replacing itself. It was teaching its hands to do two things at once. All the while, the idea of overlordship kept testing its limits. Tribute is persuasive but resentful. Marriage alliances are warm until winter. Oaths bind men until the man who gave the gift dies. Kent's leadership could not last forever. The axis of power would tilt first toward Northumbria, where two northern kingdoms would fuse into a larger brilliance, then toward the Midlands, where Mercia's iron patience would build an apparatus of control as elegant as it was feared. But Ethelbert's experiment mattered because it proved that English rulership could ride roads rather than merely raid along them, could shape law as a tool for peace rather than only as a pretext for war, and could tie this island's fate to the great conversation crossing the Channel. The mission south of the Humber was not the only Christian seed. Off to the western sea lay Iona, its monks already at prayer, and soon a gentle bishop named Aidan would walk the windswept headlands of Northumbria, speaking Irish Latin and simple holiness. Two streams of the same river would meet, and their confluence would be turbulent: how to count Easter, how to cut a tonsure, which saints to favor, whose authority to heed. Yet even that turbulence would become a kind of the strength, forcing kings to arbitrate not only among lords, but among learned men. Rulership, by degrees, took on the burden of persuading as well as compelling. For now, fix the scene in Canterbury, a wooden hall warmed by a long fire. Outside it, a church of stone where lamps smoke against newly whitewashed walls. Beyond that, streets where potters and glassmakers do the week's work, and where merchants trade rumor as readily as goods. Within the hall, a king hears disputants and speaks of fines with the rhythm of long memory, then gestures to a monk who notes the settlement on a scraped calfskin. A brooch passes as surety. A hand is taken. The matter is concluded. Afterwards, there's music. Perhaps someone recites the genealogies that make everyone present the cousin of a god. Or perhaps this is Kent. After all, a choir sings that the peace just purchased on earth is a reflection of a greater peace. This is how transformation feels from the inside, not thunder, but a new habit, practiced until it seems as old as the chalk hills. In the years just ahead, Augustine's successors would organize the English church more firmly. Ethelbert's model of law would be imitated in other courts, and the notion that an English ruler might speak for more than his own valley would become expectation rather than daring. A golden ship will be buried on a Suffolk hill. A northern court will mint saints as readily as it mints coin, and a single synod will declare what kind of church this island will be. But those later lights burn because the wick was trimmed here. Kent learned the craft of binding power to paper and prayer, and by that craft the English began to imagine a larger self. North of the old Roman road lines, two flinty kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira, learned to breathe together. Their union, fragile at first and constantly tested by death and ambition, came into focus under Edwin, who stitched coast to moor, Humber to Forth, until Northumbria sounded like a single word. His court learned the new grammar of rule oaths sworn in the mead hall, messengers spinning out along ridgeways, and a queen whose chapel kept a candle burning when politics ran cold. When Edwin fell, another kind of royalty rose. Oswald, island taught on Iona, returned with a piety that made kingship look like service, and with a friend named Aidan, quick of foot and gentle of voice, who founded a place of prayer on a tidal rock at Lindisfarne. Aidan moved lightly through the countryside with an interpreter at his side, blessing hearths and teaching children, and Oswald gave him land the way other kings gave rings. This was the century when English rulership practiced scale. Northumbria's grasp could not be measured only by swords. It ran along schools and shrines, along markets in York where silver changed hands, along roads where abbots traveled under royal protection. Kings learned because they had to that to hold disparate peoples, you must hold their imaginations. And the monastery illuminated the mind more lastingly than a raid terrified it. The glow spread. Wearmouth and Jarrow would soon rise with glazed windows and imported books. But even before that architectural confidence, the idea was in the air. Gather, teach, record became a second triad beside the old fight, feast, gift. Across the island's eastern coast, the sandhills of Suffolk concealed a different sermon on power. On a rise above the Deben, men hauled a ship up from the river and made it into a chamber of the state for the dead. The burial at Sutton Hoo, its timber ribs vanished. Its iron rivets mapping a ghost hall in the soil held a king's idea of himself, weaponry chased like winter frost, garnet inlaid ornaments that turned sunlight into blood-red fire, bowls from the Eastern Empire, and a purse frame set with creatures coiled in endless pursuit. If, as many suppose, this was Redwald of East Anglia, then the grave is a political argument as much as a sepulchre. Here is a ruler who could trade with Franks and Byzantines, who could patronize poets and smiths, who could sit in the sacred space between new Christ and old gods without falling. Even a people that burned its dead sometimes admitted that glory deserved a ship. Bede would later list a thread of over-kings Bretwaldas, who a sway tugged at the cloth beyond their own borders. Names pass like constellations: Ella of Sussex, Xolin of Wessex, Ethelbert of Kent, then Redwald or Edwin depending on which light you prefer, then Oswald and Oswiu. Later, the weight tilts toward Mercia. Their dominance was never permanent. It rolled like weather across decades. Yet the very concept matters. To imagine an island-scale authority, even one bought with tribute or stiffened by hostages, was to prepare the ground for a future single crown. Before roads became sentences in charters, they were lines of allegiance. Craft followed power, and power fed craft. In Kent, goldsmiths had already learned to fuse Mediterranean taste to Germanic pattern. In East Anglia, the funerary treasures show artisans who could set cloisonne as neatly as a priest sets words. Northumbrian halls commissioned metalwork that mirrored page art interlace, animal heads, and geometry precise enough to pass for prayer. In this age, beauty did work. It broadcast reach. Brooches traveled farther than border stones and told a strangers whose favor you enjoyed. None of this meant the old foundation disappeared. The hall still mattered. The comitatus still formed a moving circumference around a king. Generosity measured authority. The best warriors could expect a lord to support their upward climb. But the circle widened. Beside the mead bench now ran a desk near the weapons rack, a chest for parchment. Kings who had once weighed everything in cattle and land began to weigh in relics, in saintly reputations imported like fine glass, in the ability to summon bishops as well as earls to council. When a ruler granted land to a minster, he bought prayers in perpetuity and a pocket of influence the next king could not easily dislodge. Northumbria's experiment, half monastery, half war machine, set a pattern other realms felt. Wessex looked northward and saw not simply an enemy, but an apparatus. In the Thames Valley, small royal sites slowly learned to network their influence along rivers and old Roman straightaways. Essex wrestled with London and its bishopric control, the city's bishop, and you could anchor your status in a tide-ripped place where merchants thought in foreign weights. Sussex, strapped across chalk hills facing the Channel, found the simplicity of church alliance stabilizing. A grammar to organize villages stretched thin along combs and coasts. Then Mercia. Along the middle ground began to grow iron muscles. Under Penda, the Midland heartland beat loud. He was no monk king. His greatness sounded more like thunder than like chant. Yet the Mercian achievement was not merely slaughter. River systems, the Trent and its web, became Mercia's nervous tissue, carrying orders and goods. Earthworks near Tamworth and elsewhere suggest coordination and labor beyond the casual. Even in warfare's season, there is administration in the background, food gathered, roads kept passable, fords controlled. Mercia learned the choreography of musters, and that expertise lasts longer than any victory shout. Bretwalda-ship moved north, then Midland. The tilt is visible in how gifts were routed, where Ethelbert minted influence through ports and priests. Penda bought it through marriages, alliances with Welsh kings, and the relentless arithmetic of campaigns. Northumbrian kings answered with sanctity and surprise. Osweu's victory at a riverside that legend fills with broken idols, showing that even the fiercest pagan patron could be unseated by a rival who prayed and planned. Threaded through all of this was the slow weave of law. After Ethelbert's code, other kings would set down their own, not to erase custom, but to fix it. Penalties for theft, rules for church dues, protections for travelers and traders. These were the prosaic bricks of state. A people that can write its injuries and their remedies can also write its revenues. And writing frees memory from the fragility of human recall. It lets a realm be larger than the circumference of a single court's stories. Urban embryos stirred. At river mouths and old Roman crossings, trading wicks grew gridded streets, artisan quarters, plots marked by ditches rather than hedges. Their lifeblood was exchange raw wool, finished cloth, salt, iron tools, glass, wine. Kings understood the message a bustling market sent. Every ship that tied up at a wharf was a silent herald, proclaiming peace sufficient to risk inventory. Here, too, religion played its part. Minsters offered hospitality to strangers and mediated quarrels in places where dialects collided. Peace was profitable. Profit paid for peace. In this world of overlords and rivals, reputation was a currency. The Sutton Hoo burial announces reach to those who can read metal. Lindisfarne's quiet declares a different sort of a strength to those who can read devotion. Northumbria perfected this double speech. A king could be remembered in two registers by warriors for his shield wall steadiness, and by monks for his humility. That doubleness was persuasive. When hedged by marsh or mountain, distant communities needed more than fear to agree. They needed a sense that to belong to a larger name did not erase their smaller names, that their saints could sit alongside those of strangers, that their customs could persist beneath a shared law. It is tempting to imagine a straight ascent. The island's polities learning one after another the art of sophisticated rule. The truth remains naughtier. Kings died untimely, sons quarreled, plague thinned monasteries and households alike. A missionary could be expelled one year and recalled the next. A market could burn and be rebuilt in timber smoke by men who believed in both omens and opportunity. But even when the tide ran out, it left a shape in the sand that the next tide filled more quickly. By mid-century, the thought that an English ruler might order not just his own valley, but far-off shires had stopped being audacious. It had become a problem to be solved, a craft to be learned. Stand then in York on a day when the wind has blown the smell of tanneries out of town. A trader from the Rhine adjusts his scales. A scribe in a small church copies a saint's life in a hand that is no longer clumsy. Somewhere a youth recites a genealogical boast that ties the present to gods and to sea kings long gone. And imagine, at that same hour, monks at Lindisfarne chanting while tides whisper around the causeway, and south and east a tumulus, where a buried ship dreams of river light. That is the England that took shape, not a single story, but a braided one battle and book, market, and mound each a strand pulling the others taut. Soon the two Christian streams, the Roman mission in the south and the Irish taut line in the north, would clash and then reconcile under a king's arbitration, fixing how the island would keep its holy time. And the balance of power would keep swinging, the Midlands building apparatus, while the North polished sanctity into scholarship. But the outlines were clear now over lordship as a moving crown, kingship that could be argued in gold and gospel both, and beneath it all, a people beginning to think in the plural kingdoms. Yes, but moving toward a kingdom, the argument about holy time begins in a timber hall that looks out toward wind and salt monks and nobles shoulder to shoulder, the smell of wool cloaks wet from the sea mist, attention fixed on a king who has learned that politics can turn on the calendar. Oswiu presides in Whitby beside Abbess Hilda, the wise woman of the coast, while two voices shape the air. Bishop Coleman stands for the northern way tides of prayer that flow from Iona and the teaching of St. Columba, arguing that their fathers kept Easter as their fathers before them. Opposite him, Wilfrid, trained beyond the sea, speaks for Rome for the reckoning taught by Peter's successors, for a church that takes its rhythm from a single heart. They cite saints like witnesses. They debate a hairline detail like tonsure, as if salvation were braided into it. And then, the moment that turns a kingdom, Oswiu asks which apostle holds the keys of heaven. And on hearing that it is Peter, he declares that he will not gainsay the gatekeeper whose judgment he might one day require. The decision, firm and practical, sets the English church to Rome's clock, not to the tides around Iona. It did not spring from calm. For 2 generations, the island had housed twin currents of Christianity. Down in Kent, a different beginning, the year 597, and a landing in the soft light of Thanet. Augustine's small party walking up toward Canterbury with a silver cross and a painted icon lifted high. Their welcome is not guaranteed. Their hopes hang on a marriage. Ethelbert, King of Kent, has wed Bertha of the Franks, already Christian, and he allows these strangers to speak. A chapel within the old Roman walls becomes their anchor. A new archbishopric takes root where the legions once drilled. Augustine baptizes, translates, persuades. He writes home for advice, and the advice is shrewd: do not smash what you can sanctify. Leave the temples standing if you can. Cleanse them and place altar for idol. Mark the feast days, but give them a different name. The genius of the Roman mission is not only zeal, but pragmatism. Let grace enter through familiar doors. In the far north, by contrast, faith moves with a lighter tread. Oswald returns from exile on Iona carrying the cadence of Irish prayer in his speech. And with him comes Aidan, a bishop who chooses a tidal island, Lindisfarne, where causeway and sea take turns at the threshold. He teaches with his feet. He blesses with patience. When he eats at a royal table, he rises to give his portion to the poor. Faith here is lean and itinerant, fond of the open sky and the psalm murmured on a long walk. Between these two schools lies no quarrel in the essence of belief, but a real difference in habits, how and when to celebrate Easter, how to shave a monk's head, how to govern a church that must advise kings as well as baptize shepherds. The Cnut at Whitby does not abolish the northern spirit. It asks it to keep time with Rome. The consequences begin at once. Clergy who cannot assent Colman among them depart. Those who stay adopt Roman calculation and the Roman hairline, and the new lattice of authority thickens across the land. Bishops, now more closely tied to Canterbury and to papal customs, become reliable fixtures at royal councils. The great minsters take their cues from the south as well as the west. It sounds dry, this alignment about calendars and crowns, but it changes how a kingdom imagines itself. To share a feast day is to feel a rhythm that beats beyond your valley. To be corrected by a distant authority is to recognize that you're part of something wider than the bend of your own river. The change carries across the page. Benedict Biscop, a Northumbrian noble with a pilgrim's hunger, crosses and recrosses the channel, returning with relics, glaziers, and stonecutters, with armfuls of books purchased in Frankish markets. At Wearmouth and later at Jarrow, he builds churches whose windows let in more than weather. He teaches craftsmen to set light in lead so that the congregation can read in winter. Libraries grow under his care, choir books, commentaries, lives of saints in careful hands. There's no rush. It takes time to make a scriptorium hum, but when it does, the hum is national. A boy named Bede will sit in that light and fold the North's oral memory into Latin prose, producing a history that gives the island a past it can hold in one hand. Art answers theology with its own precision. On Holy Island, sometime in the early 8th century, a monk leans over leaves of calfskin, dipping his brush into pigments ground from shells, minerals, and plants. He draws knots so tight they look like prayers writ in geometry. The Lindisfarne Gospels are austerity and abundance at once, pages crammed with beasts of interlace, yet empty enough for a single word to ring. They marry the North's love of pattern to Rome's love of text. They teach eyes that doctrine and artistry need not compete. In the letters themselves, majuscule and minuscule sharing, the same stage, you can feel an island trying its hand at a European conversation, and discovering it has something to say. In halls, where power is counted in hides and hostages, kings learn to count in clauses. Law, which began in memory and was sung at the edge of fires, moves on to vellum. Ethelbert's laws are the first step, later in Wessex, and will inscribe a wider code in which fines sit beside fetters, and Jesus' commands stand next to Wergild scales. The writing does not erase custom, it frames it. Compensation for wounds is still weighed carefully, so much for a tooth, so much for a broken nose, but now churches are folded into the reckonings. Tithes and church scot appear. Sanctuary rites protect the desperate who grip an altar. Clerics gain immunities that carve out a space for the sacred within the wider law. Kings start to consult bishops as a matter of course. A charter nowadays can grant not only meadows and mills, but also freedom from certain exactions on a saint's feast. A monastery can hold a market under the crook of its abbot's staff. This new fabric doesn't simply drape the elite. Down where the fords run brown and cold, the change touches tradesmen and shepherds. Monasteries become granaries of skill looms beat in cloister rooms. Iron rings under hammer in yards that smell of smoke and tallow. Pilgrims arrive with stories and coins. Markets near minsters feel safer. Disputes can be settled by men in habits who know both scripture and the names of local fields. Christianity does not turn warriors into pacifists or kings into saints. It offers a second language in which to speak duty and mercy. When famine comes, a bishop can order church stores opened. When vengeance threatens to set fire to a district, an abbot can mediate with oaths, relics laid on the table like witnesses who do not lie. The Roman alignment brings the island's church into a web of favors and obligations that crisscross the channel. English nobles commission reliquaries from Frankish workshops. Frankish scholars read letters from English bishops. Pilgrims trade addresses for prayers. With each crossing, a habit is shared, a way of building a vault, a method for laying out a page, a chant that catches at the throat. And yet, in the weave of this traffic, the English thread keeps its color. The poetry that blooms in halls remains alliterative and iron-rich. The gospel pages still sprout hounds and birds that spring from an older forest. The conversion does not erase the heath, it baptizes it. At the edges of the map, the older gods retreat into place names and proverbs, and even there they are not scoured away so much as folded into the earth. A spring once sacred to a local spirit becomes St. Martin's Well. A grove once used for vows now hosts a stone church, where vows are made with different words. On certain feast days, villagers keep customs that a priest might frown at and then incorporate. They bring in the first sheaf, they light winter fires, now invoking saints to watch the embers. Gregory's old instruction has borne fruit: do not fight, nature turn it. All the while, rulers weigh sanctity against strategy. The Kentish kings keep a friendly hand on Canterbury. Northumbria sponsors monasteries as much for legitimacy as for love. Mercian rulers, bristling with spears, still woo bishops to their side. After Whitby, a king who refuses to host churchmen looks parochial. A king who welcomes them can claim not only God's favor, but also access to literate men who can draft treaties and remember debts without error. The pen joins the spear in defining what a realm can be. We leave the hall at Whitby with its decision sealed and a step back into the salt air. The tide is making. The causeway to Holy Island will soon drown under shining water. In Canterbury, a scribe scratches on, indifferent to the weather. In Wearmouth, a window maker smooths hot glass with a wooden paddle, watching light set like honey. Somewhere near the Thames, a reeve cites a clause from Ine's code to two men reddened with anger, and amazement enters their faces as written law, something larger than either voice decides between them. This is how an island knits itself not with a single decree, but with the patient doubling of threads, holy days in accordance, bishops in council, laws in script, art that makes the foreign feel native. When later rulers speak of England as a single thing, they will be standing on this work on the day a king chose Peter's keys. On the winters, Benedict Biscop spent collecting books. On the hands that lettered birds into the first lines of the gospel. On the clauses that granted sanctuary in a world where men still carried axes. A kingdom is a story about time as much as space. At Whitby, the English learned to keep time together. Picture a winter feast in a timber hall smoke curling into the rafters, shields ringing the walls like a second roof, a king on the high seat with gold at his wrists and the long memory of his lineage at his back. Around him, the machinery of power breathes nobles with their own halls and retinues, stewards who can reckon hides, rents, and oaths, priests whose ink fixes promises where tongues might fail. Kingship here is not simply the right to command, but the art of distribution land to bind the great, gifts to bind the brave, justice to bind the many, a ruler who feeds his people with bread and silver, who grants charters, confirms markets, and makes peace hold, earns a name that lasts longer than a victory shout. Beneath the king stand men we might call ealdormen or eorls, magnates whose estates stitch together dozens of villages and the pastures between. They ride to court with mailed companions and return with warrants, tally sticks, and new obligations. The lifeblood of their honor is the comitatus, the sworn fellowship that gathers at their board, young warriors who have pledged their strength and, by sacred oath, their lives. These war bands are more than swords for hire. They are schools of loyalty. A lord gives rings, weapons, and feasting gift for gift, and the men answer with a steadfastness in battle and attendance in council. Through such exchanges, politics is personal and enduring a chain of favors that tightens in times of war. Further down the slope of power stand the thegns, men whose status rests on a landholding, service, and presence in the 100 court. Some keep ships, some muster riders. Many keep the peace along roads and river crossings. Their houses are smaller than a magnate's, but built on the same plan of honor, a hall for hospitality, an inner chamber where records or relics lie, a yard where iron sings and oxen chew. Thanes are the spine of local government. They witness charters, lead levies when the beacon burns, and act as the king's eyes in fields the king will never see. And then the breadth of the land free farmers, the ceorls, whose names rarely enter chronicles, yet whose labor feeds the entire story. A ceorl's rights are clear. He can bear arms, attend the thing, bring suit, and swear oaths that bind. His life is measured in law by a weregild that protect him from casual violence and lets the world price his injuries in silver. He knows his acres by touch-furrow depths, the turn of the plow team, the way barley ripens a week earlier on the south-facing bend. His household is a workshop, wife and daughters at the warp-weighted loom, sons at the quern, everyone at harvest. In hard years, his neighbors are his insurance. In better years, he brings a pig for pannage into the Lord's wood, and a tithe to the church store. There are, too, the unfree men and women bound by birth, capture, or debt, household slaves and agricultural workers, whose names do not pass into writing. The law recognizes their existence with chill clarity. They can be sold, transferred, redeemed, yet even here the story is not only a cruelty. Skilled servile smiths and the stewards sometimes rise. Manumission happens at a church door with witnesses and the sound of a bell. The line between dependence and freedom is crossed in both directions, and the village remembers who helped whom in a hungry winter more keenly than it remembers a distant decree. Anglo-Saxon villages are living diagrams of adaptation. Houses are timber-framed, daubed, and thatched, floors packed earth warm beneath rushes. Near many halls sit sunken featured buildings, work pits, with plank roofs, where weave-in frames stand and fine craft can continue through cold months. The fields outside are laid to an order that pulls from experience and experiment alike ridged and furrowed strips. Ox teams hitched to ards to scratch the lighter soils and, in heavier clays, to deeper cutting plows driven by patient strength. Wheat and barley, oats and rye, peas and beans to sweeten the dirt, hay to carry beasts through a snow, cattle for milk and a status, sheep for wool, pigs for meat fattened on oak and beech mast, every animal a moving a storehouse of wealth, every buyer a bank. If farms keep the people alive, the crafts keep the realm humming. Blacksmiths are indispensable, the hinge on the Lord's door. The plowshare's bite, to a spear's edge all begin at their hearth. Potters turn out plain vessels and fine. Boneworkers carve combs that travel in a pouch to court. Woodworkers raise frames that stand against gale and time. In coastal flats, white hills of evaporated salt grow season by season. Inland, charcoal burners sharpen the forest's gift for smelting. Cloth is everywhere the steady whisper of carding, the thrum of the loom. A fine woven mantle is currency, diplomacy, and winter grace in one. Trade moves along water like a second bloodstream. River mouths and sheltered creeks sprout emporia wicks that feel new and worldly Hamwick by the Itchen. London Wick west of the old Roman walls, Giepswick on the Orwell, Eoforwick in the north. There the smell of fish meets the glitter of glass beads. There Frisian traders speak in half a dozen tongues. Their scales tip for silver shiatas and, later, sturdy pennies whose kings' names travel farther than the kings do. From across the sea come quern stones, wine, fine pottery, and hints of taste. Going out are wool, hides, slaves, salted fish, metalwork, and the quiet confidence of a people who know what they can make. Law keeps pace with exchange. In the Hundredshire courts, free men answer to their names, oaths stack like rafters, and disputes are sorted by degrees: compensation here, custody there, ban if need be. Ordeals are rare as thunder but remembered when they happen. More often it is oath-helpers' neighbors willing to stake their word who tip the balance. Writs now travel with seals and crosses. Charters sketch boundaries by oak, stream, and barrow. The church's presence can be felt in the clauses: sanctuary promised, tithes enumerated, holy days respected in the calendar of dues. Justice is not blind here. Everyone sees who you are, but it is a structure most people understand and, often enough, trust. Monasteries lean into this world not as ivory towers, but as engines. A minster grants a market day, and people arrive with baskets and gossip. A scriptorium copies a gospel and needs parchment, ink, and trained hands so it supports tanners and teachers. And the ripple runs outward. Relics draw pilgrims who need bread. Bread brings millers. Millers draw masons for sluices and wheels. The spiritual harvest is not counted in coin, yet it leaves accounts in the landscape bridges maintained for the love of God, boundary crosses set to end feuds, schools where boys learn not only psalms, but also the practical Latin of lists and tallies. Amid all of this, the hall culture that gave the age its sound persists. Gift-giving remains currency swords with pattern-welded hearts, brooches bright with filigree, cups that hold ale and promise, poetry cushions law and memory, A good lord is still a ring giver, and a warrior's worth is still measured at least partly by where he stands when the shield wall buckles. Yet a change runs under the surface. The more ink binds land to names, the more kings expect service in coin and kind, the more markets cluster, the more strangers must be treated as neighbors for a day. Honor does not evaporate, it adapts to the hum of towns. Towns themselves are a new note, first the wicks, later, in sterner times, the fortified places that we will come to call burhs. The instinct to gather and defend grows out of practice with gathering and trading. When danger thickens, mounds rise and ditches deepen, yet the purpose is double. A fortified place holds garrisons, yes, but it also holds shops, scales, courts, and memories. Power learns that it can be durable in timber and earth as well as flesh and oath. In a sense, the economy has been practicing for that shift all along. Stand again at the hall door and listen, cattle, loan buyers, a loom answers, somewhere downriver, a market bell. A reeve recites the terms of a charter to men with soil under their nails. A blacksmith sets a new shoe and grins at the spark. A monk lifts his pen and, without meaning to, locks a boundary in place for 100 years. This is the wide base on which kings and chroniclers will build rank and reciprocity, acres and oaths, tools and tithes, strangers welcomed on a Thursday for the profit they bring and the news they carry. When storms come, raiders, reforms, the hard school of siege, the society that endures them will do so because so many hands already know how to work together. Before bells called the hours, the landscape itself did. Groves hushed like chapels, springs bright as eyes, hilltops where wind arrived first. These were the thresholds where communities met the unfathomable. A Saxon might bind a prayer to a tree, float a blade to the river's silt, or leave a brooch among the reeds, gifts to powers felt rather than seen. The names given those powers carried the weather of daily life. Woden, lord of counsel and kingship. Thunor, whose hammer sounded in the storms and in the thud of piled timbers. Fridge, keeper of hearth and kin. Tew, sharp as oaths. The cosmos was not distant, it bent close, like smoke in a low-roofed hall. Ritual was seldom spectacle. It was seasonal and steady. At midwinter the world was coaxed to turn again, ale shared. Boars' heads carried in, fires stoked so fiercely the night itself seemed to shrink. In spring, fields were blessed with steps and songs. The first lambs cradled like promises. Harvest brought its own old courtesies. The last sheaf reaped and dressed. The oxen garlanded, the strong made gentle by gratitude. A community was a wheel, and religion the grease that kept it from grinding. Then Christianity came not only with doctrines, but with decisions. How to fold a new grammar of holiness over an old one without tearing either. Often the answer was tenderness. Many churches rose where groves had stood. Holy wells kept their water and acquired new saints' names. Processions traced the same lanes as older rites, but with psalms on their lips. Missionaries learned what the people loved and refused to disdain it. Festivals moved, not vanished. Yule warmed into Christmas. A springtide of hope gathered round Easter. Saints' feasts tethered the year like bright knots on a cord. If the gods of thunder and kingship faded, their places of meeting did not. Familiar paths led toward unfamiliar heavens. Conversion altered more than prayer. It touched the business of life and death. Early burials, where ashes rested in urns among the ancestors, whispered of a world in which fire returned the body to the elements, and grave goods traveled with the spirit knives, combs, beads, a warrior's spear or a woman's keys. Status lay plainly in the ground, rich graves glimmered with imported glass and gold, modest ones with the tools of ordinary days. Horse burials, and more rarely, ships' great timbers turned into coffins for kings spoke of voyaging beyond sight. Later, with crosses at the head and graves set east to west, the dead lay whole in earth, and the grave goods thinned. Yet even then, a brooch might nestle at a collarbone, a knife at a hip, the old instinct to provision the journey lingering beneath new promises. What the living told themselves about fate never lost its bite. Weird, call it happenstance, destiny, the shape events make when they lock together was no excuse for inaction. It was the weather. A man still needed to sail. In halls bright with firelight and the clatter of cups, a scop drew that philosophy into verse. The alliterative line, 4 beats strong as hoofs, carried memory like a river carries driftwood kenning and formula, craft and improvisation. A man might hear his grandfather's deeds reshaped tonight, new in rhythm, old in marrow. Glory in such songs was not mere boasting, it was a currency of example, a social glue. Remember, the poem said, and by remembering, be like this. Some poems grew so large they could shelter whole generations. We name one Beowulf. Though its coasts are Scandinavian, its mind is thoroughly Saxon kingship as gift-giving and burden, monsters as the dark debts lurking under fame, the long ache of time, how victory sours, how halls fall silent. The poet knows ships down to their rivets, rings to their filigree, swords to the pattern in their steel. It is a world of accurate things and urgent moods. The poem loves the ring giver, warns the reckless boast, and honors the thinned smile of an old warrior who has outlived his first audience. Even its monsters are so strangely familiar, they punish pride, greed, and neglect. They arrive when oaths loosen and the hall grows careless with its guests. That a poem so soaked in voice should reach us in ink is a kind of miracle. Monks, those patient carpenters of words, learned the measure of the vernacular and began to trust it with permanent work. To copy a book is to build a vessel, to translate is to rig it for a different sea. When kings later urged translations, homilies, histories, wisdom texts into the common tongue, they were not merely pious, they were practical. Law, prayer, and counsel take firmer hold when they arrive in the words a plowman uses for weather and hunger. In the scriptorium, everyday life and sacred art share a desk. A boy shapes letters until they sit alike. A senior hand draws a capital alive with beasts that bite their own tails. Parchment is expensive. Errors are scraped, thin, and mended. Pigments come from earth and trade green from copper, red from cinnabar, gold leaf as breathless to apply as a snow on a candle. A gospel page might be as bright as May, yet between the radiance, the script is workmanlike, clear, meant to be read aloud, to survive thumbing and time. Books travel as gifts between rulers, as prizes for monasteries, as anchors for communities that want to be more than weathered wood and rumor. Outside the cloister, words continue their older work. In the 100 Court, oaths are a kind of poem. The right men speaking the right formula cures a quarrel better than blood. In the hall, praise songs wheel through genealogy and treaty, teaching the young how to listen for honor's shape. And somewhere, a clerk begins what will become a habit, noting the year's tidings in the language of his neighbors. A chronicle is first a broom for memory here, a famine, there a comet, then a king's death and a succession, but with time it becomes a mirror. This is what we thought mattered, and when, and why. Set in many monasteries, copied and expanded, such notes turn into a living national memory, where triumph and failure sit shoulder to shoulder. Belief does not float above this society, it soaks into it. A market day placed under a saint's protection encourages fair measure. A bridge endowed for the soul of a dead then keeps carts from drowning in winter and loosens the teeth of isolation. Relics draw not only pilgrims, but also bakers, coopers, ferrymen. A fast reorganizes kitchens. A feast reorganizes grief. The priest who blesses a field stands between weather and work, not to cancel either, but to persuade them to marry well. And the oldest stories, they do not vanish. They are house spirits now, or the caution in a mother's proverb. Tunur's sign crosses into a christened gesture. Woden's hunger for knowledge is rebuked, then borrowed by scholars who love a good riddle. Between altar and hearth, the traffic runs both ways. What matters most to rulers and reeves and reapers alike is that the village move together through the year without coming apart at the seams. By the time this culture reaches its high noon, the weave is tight. Pagan memory, Christian order, hall virtue, market habit, sung story, written law, none cancels the other. They sit like alternate planks in a longship, flexing with the sea. Soon, storms will test that hull. But the strength begins in how the boards are joined. A people who know how to say the right words at the right time, how to remember, how to keep old places holy while giving them new names, such a people are hard to break. So we leave them here for a moment at evening lamp lit in the chancel, last light gold on the bier, a harp's low ripple in a hall where the day's work is counted and the youngest asks for a story before sleep. The storyteller clears his throat. Fate is the weather, he says, and honor is the sail. The sea tonight looks black as pitch, but the keel bites true. By the time the frost lifted from the hedgerows, after Alfred's long struggle, the map of the island looked like a garment torn and darned West Saxon territory stitched to Mercian lands. Danish law holding fast in the east and north. The story now turns on quieter virtues than miracle victories planning. Patience, the rhythm of hammers on fresh-built ramparts. Edward, Alfred's son, did not inherit his father's myth. He inherited his system, and at his side, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes a whetstone to his iron, stood his sister Athelstan, lady of the Mercians, who carried her husband's title after his death and did not let it slip. They did not promise their people sudden glory. They promised walls. The burh had begun as Alfred's answer to fire and sails. Under Edward and Athelstan, it became a habit of safety. Timber and turf climbed into ordered lines, ditches bit the earth. Streets were measured so carts could pass, and markets set their stalls. A burh was more than a fence. It was a calendar and a conscience. Each hide, each tract of land, and the people tied to it, owed so many feet of wall and so many men for so many days. The arithmetic is dry on parchment. In life, it meant a kingdom knowing itself well enough to ask and to answer. Who will come when the horn sounds? When the horn did sound, the answer could be counted. They moved not only with men, but with time. Edward went where a Danish stronghold shadowed his borders. A new fort would rise across the river, one tooth meeting another in a closed bite. Ethel fled, thinking like water, slipped along valleys to place fortresses where roads crossed and where retreat felt least comfortable for an enemy. She made a rosary of towns Bridgenorth, Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick, each bead close enough to feel the next. A burh that could hold a garrison could also hold a fair, and a fair meant coin, and coin meant the possibility of a soldier's better shod next winter. Siege war became the ordinary theater of courage, no longer the shock of open ground alone, but trenches under arrows, mantlets pushed forward as if the earth itself wore armor. We see, in the imagination, carpenters climbing ladders with axe and auger. We hear the dull percussion of rams. We smell the green sap of freshly cut timber turned into fighting towers. The point was not to annihilate, but to compel. Leave an enemy with one good choice, and often he will take it. Derby, 9/17. Ethelflaed's men forced entry at 4 of its gates. The fighting was close and blind, bodies meeting in alleys where the world narrowed to the length of a spear and the width of a shield. Losses among her household troops were heavy. The annal keeps their memory without the generosity of names. Yet the town fell, and with it, one of the 5 boroughs that had anchored Danish rule in the Midlands. Leicester yielded soon after, not from terror, but from mathematics. A fortress isolated from help learns prudence. The method was working, and method has a way of turning itself into mood. Those who once hoped to raid learned instead to bargain. Those who once bargained learned at last to bend the knee. Edward pressed on along the Trent and Welland, building, garrisoning, taking oaths, and repairing the palisade of Mercia and Wessex into a single wall. Nottingham, Stamford, Lincoln, names that today feel safely inland were then river doors through which armies could come and go. To hinge those doors, to bar them, meant that the heartland of a future England could begin to beat in one rhythm. The Mercians returned to Tamworth as to a hearth long left cold. Ealdormen measured out obligations. Reeves standardized tolls and weights. And the countryside, which endures all kings, learned a different way to sleep at night. Ethelflaed's last year held a star's odd flare. Northumbria's men of York sent to her, asking for protection and friendship. It is said they were ready to recognize her lordship. That promise evaporated with her breath in 918. Even so, in the weeks between her death and her daughter's displacement by Edward, we glimpse the horizon of what might have been a union stretching to the old Roman line, negotiated through trust in the woman whose letters and walls carried equal force. After Edward came Athelstan, the nephew who would draw the logic of the reconquest all the way out to its conclusion, where his grandfather was the savior, his father the builder. Athelstan was the gatherer, the hand that pulled the drawstring tight. His court moved with a new confidence. his charters with a new exactness. He bound the Welsh by tribute and respect. He yoked the West Country firmly to the center, and in the north he tested alliances with the patient suspicion of a commander who had seen cities change banners twice in a week. York was the key still left unturned. The Danish kings there were practical men and proud ones. They understood revenues and the useful terror of sudden force. Athelstan's campaigns into Northumbria were not single gambles, but sequences, each a step forcing the next, a town cowed, a noble brought into fosterage, a marriage glimpsed and then withdrawn. When he took York in 927, lords from across the island came to pay him honor, and for a brief season the title King of the English no longer felt like a hope written ahead of the day. It felt descriptive. Unity invites challenge. In 937, a coalition gathered like weather behind a hill. Olaf of Dublin, with sea-tough men who knew every tide trick. Constantine of Alba, with his tested spears. Owen of Strathclyde, with riders who loved a flank. Their logic was the old logic of neighbors better to check a rising power before it finishes its breakfast. Athelstan's answer was to call the musters, clear the roads, bless the standards, and march. We call the meeting Brunanburh, and we place it on half a dozen maps, none certain. What is certain is what the English felt as the light went the grit of a full day's fight in the teeth, the weight in arms that have swung too long, the minute-by-minute bargaining between courage and exhaustion. Household troops, those men who ate at the king's board and would one day die for him, stood in the front rank where the first shock breaks. The third came in behind, men from fields and markets, whose courage had been trained by years of ordinary obligations performed in unremarkable weather. The fighting lasted from prime to vespers, the line bowing and straightening like a branch in a steady wind. Cavalry sawed the seam, archers burned through their quivers, princes fell, king's kin bled out into the grass. At last, the coalition cracked. Olaf fled to his ships with what he could save. Constantine counted the dead and saw his household thinned. The English did not pursue far. Victory has its own exhaustion, and the wise count what they have kept rather than what more they might risk. The poem the chronicle preserves about that day is not delicate. It is as plain as a whetstone, and just as useful. It names the killing, and it names the keeping, the island's king holding his fields against the Northmen's pride. In a land where unity had always been provisional, Brunanburh felt like something that might last. For a generation it did. Around these campaigns, administrative sinew thickened. Coins struck with the king's name toothed easily into the gears of trade. Markets under burh walls had rules written clearly enough that a stranger could gamble fairly with his day's labor. Law codes balanced Christian conscience with old compensation customs, so that justice looked both merciful and familiar. It is tempting to think of reconquest as a set of dots on a battle map, but the truer victory was a habit taught that oaths run downward as well as upward, that weights are honest in Gloucester as in Lincoln, that a reeve's seal means the same thing west of the Severn as east of the Ouse. There were, of course, frictions. Borders do not turn into friendships overnight. Danish settlers in the Danelaw brought their own law words and customs into the English fold. English courts, in absorbing them, learned new efficiencies and a brisker style of record. Place names kept the memory of ships, of farms, of men called by northern names who married southern women and argued over hedge lines in a steady, unheroic peace. The hybrid vigor of such places would outlast the anxiety that birthed it. If you looked then, from a hill above the Trent, you would have seen the signs of a country knitting a line of pack horses between burhs, each with bells like small arguments. A new church roof sending its last steam into a cool morning. A troop of mounted messengers carrying writs that all looked the same no matter whom they inconvenienced. You would also have seen what makes unity tender, a river still wide enough for ambition, a winter long enough to test stores, a memory long enough to keep tally of what the neighbors did in your father's time. Yet the general motion was inward, toward a center that could govern without shouting, having survived the age of ships and fire by inventing durable routines. The English now began to believe in those routines as more than emergency measures. They were a way of being, burhs to live inside, coin to count with, law to appeal to even when one was wrong. It is not honey for the poet's tongue, but it is bread for 1,000 tables. When at last the banners came home and were folded, and the men told stories to make the hard parts manageable, they did not speak only of strokes and shouts. They spoke of measuring walls by the foot and finding the calculation right, of a market day that finished peaceably even when strangers came, of a letter from the king that arrived before the trouble spread. These are the kinds of victories that last long enough for a language to grow around them. If unity was won upon the slope at Brunanburh, it was kept at a desk. The mature Anglo-Saxon realm learned to breathe in long measures in audits and oaths, in courts that met when they should, in coins that rang the same from Cornwall to the Humber. The royal household, once a moving camp of spears and spoils, thickened into a writing office and a memory. Clerks with steady hands copied formulas that turned favors into law. Charters were braced with witnesses whose names were themselves a currency. A king might ride out to hunt, but his power moved in parchment compact words that could cross a shire by lantern light and bind a dispute before steel was drawn. From that center, the country arranged itself into squares that were not visible from a hill, but you could feel them all the same, shires, each with an ealdorman to carry the king's voice. Beneath them, hundreds, where reeves convened monthly courts and weighed quarrels the way a good butcher weighs meat plainly, publicly, precisely. A freeman could stand in such a court and state his case. A neighbor could swear to his worth. A wrong could be priced and paid. It was not a perfect mercy. It was something harder and rarer, a habit. Money made that habit travel. Silver pennies bright, clipped circles of agreement bore the king's name and a moneyer's, and their weight was the promise. Recoinage kept the promise fresh. Old faces went back to the mint. New faces came out with edges clean enough to shave with. By Edgar's time, there were mints in dozens of towns, more than 60 under Ethelred, so that a market in York might trust a price in Winchester. The geld assessed in hides and demanded in coin was the state's long arm, the tax that measured fields and fear alike, feeding garrisons and shipyards, and, at bad moments, buying time from enemies who understood silver better than sermons. All this administration needed rooms to live in. A writ requires a chest requires a hall, and a hall calls for a church at its shoulder. So stone rose. Anglo-Saxon builders, patient with plumb line and mallet, set narrow naves and bold towers, ornamented with blind arcades and familiar beasts curling into vine. At Bradford on Avon, St. Lawrence stands like a miracle of proportion, upright, exact, and quiet as a held breath, proof that even before the Normans the island knew how to dress faith in a stone. Windows took glass, doors took iron, and the bell in the small tower spoke a language that all understood. Come, gather, listen. Where there is stone and coin, there is also ink. The monastic reform that warmed the 10th century Benedictine discipline, stitched to royal will, made rooms for learning as carefully as for prayer. At Winchester, Glastonbury, Abingdon, Canterbury, scriptoria glowed with lamplight while winter shouldered the walls. Quills rasped, pigments were ground smooth as flour. Thin gold leaf trembled on a breath and then lay down to shine forever. The Winchester style married older insular spirals to frank, assertive figures. Borders grew leaves and beasts. Capital letters opened like doors. In the benedictional of St. Ethelwald, the saints stand tall and luminous, Roman in their drapery and English in their cheer, the pages humming with an assurance that order itself can be beautiful. Out of those schools came voices that still sound familiar when read aloud by a fire. Elfric of Aynsham, clear, exact, kindly severe-shaped homilies that taught doctrine without breaking the layman's patience, translating the high roof of theology into beams you could count. Wulfstan of York thundered in a different key, his sermon of the wolf naming sins and storms, until even the benches seem to creak. Between them, you hear a kingdom trying to talk to itself with adult words, not just who holds the fort, but how a soul keeps its footing when the river rises. For rise it did. Ships learned the inlets by heart again. The same administrative muscle that could build a boor could also gather Danegeld in the stacks that made a floor groan. Great payments meant to purchase a season of peace from captains who smiled and took the coin, and then, next year, returned with cousins who had heard about English generosity. More than 150,000 pounds of silver went out under Ethelred's troubled seal, across a reign that knew far too many winters of bad counsel and better hindsight. The burhs are still stood, the fyrd still mustered, but warfare had thickened fast columns, surprise winter campaigns, fleets that could split and reunite like quicksilver. If Alfred imagined a navy, his grandchildren tried to make one ordinary. Ship soaks were levied. New designs were tested, longer keels, higher gunwales, crews trained to fight above water as cleanly as on it. Some summers the sea went English, others it answered to Scandinavian kings who could braid fleets from Norway, Denmark, and Dublin and more besides, adding cavalry and siege engines to the old recipes of speed and terror. The island learned again that defense is a practice, not a posture. From practice came the worst proofs. Sweyn Forkbeard pressed his claim with a mathematician's patience and a raider's appetite, landing where the larder was full, lifting hostages, testing garrisons, and always counting. The Danegeld that once bought departures now bought footholds. Then Cnut, cool, devout, and hard took the argument to its inevitable end. In 1016, after the drawn-out saw of campaigns and standoffs, London holding stubbornly like a knot in tough rope, the North Sea's arithmetic added England as a possession among others, it would be a mistake to imagine only foreign boot prints on wet clay. What came was not simply a conquest, but a consolidation. Cnut governed with a craftsman's respect for the tool already in his hand. English law spoke, and he listened, then answered in the same language. Shires stayed shires, hundreds stayed hundreds. Writs went out with the brisk confidence of a system that did not need to be explained to workmen. He elevated earls on the Danish model, yes, but appointed Englishmen where Englishmen were best. He walked the cloisters with generosity, endowing old houses and founding new. He prayed at Ely in verse that sounds almost like homesickness. He traveled to Rome to bargain better tolls and safer roads for his subjects. A king who understood that piety could be a diplomacy no sword could match. Court, under him, became a confluence. Danes and English shared benches, tables, marriages, lawsuits, feasts. Words crossed over law terms and nicknames. Kitchen slang and shipboard swearing working themselves into the grain of English like threads of a deeper color. Traders found that North Sea winds blew both ways now. York sent goods to Rye. London weighed cloth against Baltic furs. Coins with Cnut's face paid masons in Winchester and carpenters in Odense. The empire he held Denmark, Norway. England was a weather pattern more than a wall, but while it lasted, the island breathed a larger air. If the sword rested in its scabbard a little more often, the hammer did not. Reform deepened. Monasteries kept their strict clocks and their cheerful workshops. The chancery's Latin grew taut and legible. Old English prose reached a full strength capable of philosophy and law. 10th century architectural habits turned towards amplitude, crypts broadened. Chancels stretched early hints of the Romanesque scale that would later run like a river through Norman shells. You can walk today into late Saxon towers at Earl's Barton, at Barnack, where long and short coins stack like a mason's prayer, and feel the poise of a people who knew how to square ambition to means. Armies adjusted as well. The housecarls, professional hearth troops in mail with axes like doors, stood at a king's elbow in hall and on field. The fyrd remained the breathing body of the nation, summoned by writ, rotating duties so that fields were not all left foolishly to weeds. Castles, in the continental sense, were rare, yet motte and bailey still a foreign fashion, but earthwork and palisade multiplied where roads met rivers. There's courage in charge and countercharge. There's another kind in the boredom of drill, the care for spearheads, the quiet order of watch lists posted and obeyed through rain. For all the competence, the century kept its sorrows. Famine shadowed armies. Plague traveled on the same roads as charters. Oaths broke under pressure. Kings died, leaving toddlers or none. Yet when you step back from the jolts and the griefs, the silhouette is steady, a kingdom that could mint with rigor, tax with system, judge in public, build in stone, and teach in its own tongue had made itself heavy enough to resist the gusts. It could be conquered as all things can, but even conquest would learn its language to command. Cnut's death loosened the weave of the North Sea, and with it England's strange belonging to two weather systems at once, the island trained by a century of counting, building, and writing stood ready to choose again who would sign its coins and stamp its writs. What it could not know, as monks still pricked lines on parchment and masons set lime to stone, was that the next choice would invite in a kinship more dangerous than any raid a family claim from across a narrow channel, with horses bred for the shock, archers drilled to the minute, and a different theory of what a wall is for. But that is tomorrow's noise, and the 10th century deserves its own quiet. Picture the reeve in the 100th court, cutting a tally and binding it with care. Picture the moneyer striking true. Picture a monk laying gold as thin as breath onto the page. Picture the bell at nuns, calling equal souls to kneel. These are the sounds by which a people teach themselves to outlast their weather. Edward the Confessor's reign felt like a held breath, gentle, pious, and edged with foreign weather. He had learned his manners in Normandy. The sea salt of exile clung to his court. Stone began to dream in new shapes at Westminster, and the king's gaze wandered south across the channel as often as it rested on the Weald. Yet under the painted saints and careful penmanship, old England's pulses still beat, shires convened, hundreds argued, writs flew, ealdormen and reeves weighed quarrels by law's bright measure. It was a house lived in by two families at once, Anglo-Saxon rooms, lit with Norman candles. When Edward died without an heir in January of 1066, the breath released. 3 claims stepped forward, each dressed in certainty. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, the island's first servant and perhaps its surest sword, took the crown with the Witan's swift assent and the rumor of a deathbed nod. Across the sea, Duke William of Normandy laid his own right upon the table, a promise Edward had once whispered. He said, and an oath Harold himself had sworn on relics so holy their silence rang louder than any witness. Far north, Harold Hardrada of Norway, last of the great sea kings, read an older pact as a title deed and began to gather ships until harbors looked like forests turned upside down. The summer held its breath again. Harold ringed the southern coast with men and warning fires. His household troops, bright as flints, struck in the sun, the feared rotating home and back in weary rhythm. William, pinned by contrary winds, did not come. Then in September, the north opened like a trap door. Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, flame still in his throat, landed with iron enough to tilt Yorkshire's horizon. Edwin and Morcar fought at Fulford on the 20th and were beaten down into the marsh. Harold turned all his lines northward and marched 4 days as if the road sloped downward, his men arriving lean, sore, and still dangerous. Stamford Bridge on the 25th was a reckoning seen across a narrow plank of timber and across a generation shield to shield, oath to oath. Hardrada died as kings of saga should, without turning his back, Tostig with him, and the Norwegian fleet sailed home so emptied that 24 ships sufficed for the survivors. England roared with relief. A crown felt secure on a head that had earned it twice in 5 days. Then the Channel answered. William landed at Pevensey on the 28th, finding shingle and quiet. He raised a wooden castle as if he had brought a house flat-packed from Normandy. And then he ranged the Sussex countryside with deliberate cruelty, pasture burned black, barns broken like crust of bread, forcing Harold to return before the year's grass could grow again. The English king's men turned south at once, gathering new levies as they marched, the standard of the dragon binding tired hands into purpose. They chose their ground at Senlac Hill on the 14th of October, a ridge with its flanks protected and its brow fit for a steadfast men. What followed has been told with thread and miniature and the breath of singers, but the truth still rides in the details. William set his army in 3 tongues, Breton, Norman, French, and gave them 3 ways to speak arrows first, then infantry to test the wall, then cavalry to break what the first 2 loosened. The English shield wall stood like a hedge laid by experts tight, living and prickly. Arrows rattled harmlessly from it. Swords met oak and iron and the long-handled axes of the housecarls, which fell not like weapons, but like sentences. When the Norman left, broke, and ran, parts of the English line did what men do. When they feel an enemy's back under their hands, they pursued. William saw it and learned in a heartbeat. Feigned flight pulled more from the hedge. Countercharge cut them where they ran. The line thinned, recovered, thinned again. Some say Harold fell to an arrow in the eye, some to a knot of knights shouldering through the last ranks to find his banner. Either way, his death broke a spell. Where the dragon standard had stood, men had been one thing. Where it toppled, they became many things again, brave, stubborn, frightened, exhausted, each man suddenly alone with his choices. The field went to William before the light failed. Night remembered the dead kindly, morning counted them. England did not end at Hastings, it unstitched. William moved with a solicitor's patience backed by a soldier's timing as spurs at Southwark, then north and west to cross the Thames, where it could not bite, harrying as he went until London felt hunger on its skin and prudence in its bones. The great men submitted at Berkhamsted, Edgar Etheling, last shoot of the old royal oak, bent like a green branch in winter. On Christmas Day in Westminster, beneath arches Edward had raised, William received the crown, Latin and French acclamations rising as the guards outside mistook the roar for riot and answered in fire. It was an omen and a lesson. Misunderstanding travels faster than orders. Occupation wrote itself into earth and office. Castles lifted overnight motte and bailey, timber first, and then, in time, a stone like teeth set into the jaw of a landscape. Sheriffs hardened into Norman hands. Earldoms were broken, recombined, and awarded to men whose swords had already signed their petitions. The church felt the new broom as swiftly as the Shire Lanfranc of Bec took Canterbury. A reformer with the measuring eye of a jurist, and the old English bishops left their sees like tides going out. Latin hummed, new rules bit. Monasteries borrowed continental strictness and continental grandeur. None of this erased the machinery it used. Writs still retched reeves. Shires still convened. The system that had carried Alfred and Athelstan now carried their conqueror, proving the hardest thing to capture is a habit. The North rose in 1069. William answered not like a king, but like a weather event. The harrying left behind a map of absence barns ash smeared, millstones cracked, fields unsown, census takers in later years writing waste, so often the word lost its edges. Famine follows fire as surely as shadow follows a man with a lamp. People moved, starved, vanished. Hereward, made of Ely, an island twice over by water and by oaths, and for a while the reeds hid hope. but causeways can be built. Oaths can be outlasted. The Fenlands learned the sound of Norman boots, too. Then came the book. In 1086, a scribes went out under orders as clear as frost what is held, by whom, since when, and what it pays. The Domesday Survey did not judge, it recorded, and in doing so it fixed the conquest to figures that could not blush. Almost all great lands had changed hands. Almost all new hands were not English. And yet the categories were English, the measures English, the habit of record English. The new lords had won a country and then discovered that to keep it, they must learn its tables of law and length, its deep grammar of doing things in public. Language assorted itself the way rivers do when they braid Latin in chancery and choir, French in court and tourney, English by hearth and market, changing as it spoke. French words came like guests who never left, settling into law, war, fashion, food. English kept the house's foundations kin, bread, field, water, love, fear, right, wrong. The tongue that survived was not the tongue that began, and yet it carried in its everyday bones the same Saxon fluency in action verbs and weather, in homely nouns and blunt justice. If resistance faded, memory did not. The old ways persisted in corners and in customs, the 100 court's preference for witness and payment, the shire's rhythm, the expectation that a man might meet law in daylight and understand what it required. Norman power stood on those floors even as it changed the ceiling. The great churches climbed, the cathedrals advanced like armies of stone. The castles learned masonry, but underfoot the measures were familiar. What did the Saxons lose? Their kingship, their nobility, their right to decide the island's future by their own counsel. What did they leave that could not be taken? The administrative spine that even the conqueror found useful, the legal temper that insisted custom matters, the language that would, over centuries, invite every influence to dinner and yet taste of the same assault at its core. Look for them in the sheriff's title, in the shire's persistence, in the jury's stubborn sense that neighbors must speak to a neighbor's guilt. Listen for them in the common words with which you greet the day. History does not tuck us in. It leaves lamps burning. The rise of the Saxons from marsh and heath to burh and book and their fall before a different kind of army ends not in silence, but in continuity. William's England is not Edward's, and yet Edward's England kept William's books, balanced William's taxes, and spoke to William's judges in a voice he had to learn to hear. If you walk a lane at dusk anywhere between the Downs and the Danelaw, you can still pass a church whose tower stones were set by hands trained before the conquest, can read a place name that outlived half a dozen dynasties, can say aloud a word for home that would have made sense by an Anglo-Saxon hearth. Empires come and go, habits endure. The Saxons taught the island how to endure.